Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Wonderful morning. Great to have all of you here with us this morning. Welcome to our conference on accessibility for diverse communities, the role of cultural institutions, organized by Culture Academy Singapore. Now, before we begin, for those of you not familiar, we are going to be using Pigeonhole Live. So I would like to walk you through the process to set it up, just so later on you can ask questions to our panel later on. So first, if you can take out your mobile phones or your smartphones first, please. Please log on to this URL. It's pigeonhole.at, pigeonhole.at. You can follow the instructions on the screen as well. The conference code, CACONF2018. So I'll give you some time to log in. So this will be for polling, this will be for asking questions to our panel, and also for feedback at the end of this event. So once again, CACONF2018. I'll just give you all some time to log in before we do a very simple exercise with everyone present here today. So just want to walk you through as well. Later on, if you ask a question, now others can also upvote on those questions as well. So the questions with the most number of upvotes, the moderator may choose to answer them first. So during the panel session, you can scroll through all the questions that are asked and feel free to upvote or downvote any questions. Okay, I'll give you about 30 more seconds just so we can log in. Once again, pigeonhole.at. Key in the event passcode is CACONF2018. Okay, great. So I think we are ready. Let's start with a simple poll, shall we? Okay, you see the session, warm-up session for day one. Please click on that. Cast your vote. Okay, we're going to do a simple poll with everybody. We're going to bring it up live on the screen as well. So the first question, how is your day today? So let us know how you're feeling today. All right, very good. Extremely elated. Some of you are super excited or exhilaratingly thrilled. So please tell us about your morning this morning. To our friends just joining in as well, very good morning. Okay, let's have question one first. Okay, great. So some of you super excited, some of you extremely elated. Wi-Fi, okay, I'll bring that on in just a bit. Okay, I'll bring that on in just a bit. Okay, just let's walk through this. Thank you. Okay, so Wi-Fi password you can see right on the top. December 2018 CA. All right, so for those of you, if you want to log on to Wi-Fi, we have a Wi-Fi network here today, and also the password on the screen just above, right in the top portion of the slide. Okay, great. So how are all of you this morning? Many of you are super excited. I'm very super excited as well because we have a very, very exciting opening performance that we're going to bring to all of you. So I shall keep that a surprise for now. Okay, some of you are extremely elated as well. Okay, how about question two? Let's take a look. What is the day today? Okay, a few people said it's 31st December. I think you're in the holiday mood. Well, it's Christmas, right, after all, and well, not Chinese New Year, but New Year as well coming. So this is just to get you familiar with the interface of Pigeonhole. So during the sessions as well, during the panel sessions, please feel free at any time to use this platform to ask your questions. We'll be glad to have the moderator pick your question if there are many upvotes or if the moderator thinks that your question would benefit everyone. All right, so please log on to the Pigeonhole at all times. Also, admin announcements. I just want to remind all our guests to please kindly switch your mobile and your electronic devices to the silent mode for the duration of this conference. Now also, we do have sign language interpreters today. So if you, for any reason, you see anyone who needs any sign language help, well, we have a session, just the first row here. We have a sign language interpreter in the house today. All right, so our guest of honor is Ms. Sim Ann, Senior Minister of State. She will be arriving very shortly. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. We will be starting this event very shortly. Thank you. Let me break the silence here. It's very silent. So once again, a very good morning. Well, I'm told that our guest of honor is walking here. She'll be arriving very shortly. But we have a very fun day today. We have a full day as well. We have many speakers from all across the world coming today to share with us on this wonderful topic, accessibility for diverse communities, the role of cultural institutions. Also today, our keynote speaker is Dr. David Fleming. And of course, we do have a few panels today as well. Tea break and lunch provided for all our guests today as well. Later on, it will be from this door. All right, so later on, I'll invite all of you to exit from this door. After our keynote speech, we will also be having a Memorandum of Understanding signing ceremony. So that will be happening later on as well, just before the first tea break, and after which we'll come back for the panel session before we break for lunch. And of course, you can see our first performance all ready to get started. I'm very excited. We saw them during the rehearsal. It's very, very interesting. Of course, very passionate as well. So I hope all of you will enjoy and support our performance here today also. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to give a big round of applause to welcome our guest of honor, Ms. Sim Ann, Senior Minister of State, Ministry of Communications and Information and Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. A very good morning to our guest of honor, Ms. Sim Ann, Senior Minister of State, Ministry of Communications and Information and the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Deputy Secretary, Culture, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth and Chief Executive Officer of the National Arts Council. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Welcome to the Culture Academy's conference on accessibility for diverse communities, the role of cultural institutions. My name is Lester Liu. It's my pleasure to be your MC for this conference. To begin this morning's proceedings, we have planned something a little different for you. In the spirit of innovation and doing things differently, we have veered away from starting the conference with intellectually stimulating speeches to an inspiring performance for you to sit back and enjoy. Fresh from their collaboration for Sunburst 2018, the performers from Muscular Dystrophy Association Singapore and School of the Arts will be performing a song from the movie The Greatest Showman. Let me share with you the meaningful lyrics, and I quote, "When the sharpest words want to cut me down, I'm going to send a flood, going to drown them out. I am brave, I am bruised, I am who I'm meant to be. This is me." Unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me. Give a big round of applause to welcome the performance, This Is Me.
I'm not a stranger to the dark. Hide away, they say, 'cause we don't want your broken parts. I've learned to be ashamed of all my scars. Run away, they say, no one will love you as you are. But I won't let them break me down to dust. I know that there's a place for us, for we are glorious. When the sharpest words wanna cut me down, I'm gonna send a flood, gonna drown them out. I am brave, I am bruised, I am who I'm meant to be. This is me, look out, 'cause here I come. And I'm marching on to the beat I drum. I'm not scared to be seen, I make no apologies. This is me, won't let their shame sink in. We are bursting through the barricades and reaching for the sun. We are warriors, yeah, that's what we've become. I won't let them break me down to dust. I know that there's a place for us, for we are glorious. When the sharpest words wanna cut me down, I'm gonna send a flood, gonna drown them out. I am brave, I am bruised, I am who I'm meant to be. This is me, look out, cause here I come. And I'm marching on to the beat I drum. I'm not scared to be seen, I make no apologies. This is me, down. I'm gonna send a flood, gonna drown them out. I am brave, I am bruised, I am who I'm meant to be. This is me. Look out, cause here I come. And I'm marching on to the beat I drum. I'm not scared to be seen, I make no apologies. This is me, this is me,
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a big round of applause, everyone. Wonderful performance. Thank you so much. Our friends from the Muscular Dystrophy Association Singapore and School of the Arts, I think they deserve another round of applause for such a wonderful, wonderful performance. Thank you very much to all our performers. So that was such a nice opening performance to start off today's conference. Once again, a very good morning and a very warm welcome. We will be starting now with the intellectually stimulating part of today's program. I would like to invite Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Deputy Secretary Culture, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and Chief Executive Officer of the National Arts Council to deliver her opening remarks. Mrs. Daniel, please.
Well, that was certainly very inspiring and more than words and speeches for a start to 2 wonderful days, I hope. Good morning, Mr. Mann, Senior Minister of State for Culture, Community and Youth, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Culture Academy's annual conference that we do each year around this time. And it's very nice to do it in a different location. Every so often we come to different spaces, and today is a special experience, I hope, for all of us to be in a recital studio instead of a normal auditorium. So the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth established the Culture Academy in 2015, and this was with the objective of developing our cultural leadership and strengthening our external linkages to foster knowledge exchanges. Over the past 3 years, the Academy has organized many conferences and professional development workshops tapping on local expertise and international trainers. Some notable examples include the timely conference on digital developments with experts from the UK, US, the Netherlands, and Australia in 2016. This was followed by an insightful conference on placemaking, bringing in cultural leaders from the region, including Malaysia and Indonesia in 2017. We also organized the Molro seminar with the French government in 2018. Besides these major conferences, the Academy runs regular and frequent programs, such as the series that we call In Conversation With, offering exposure to relevant topics such as fundraising and museum management. The Academy publishes an annual journal called Cultural Connections, which features many of our top cultural leaders and international counterparts. This year, in commemoration of Singapore's chairmanship of ASEAN, a special issue was published with 1,500 copies disseminated at ASEAN ministerial and official meetings. As a leadership institute under the ministry, the Academy plans its own curriculum to ensure that the objectives of building shared purpose and effective cultural leadership are met. We tap on our own public and private sector leaders, academics, and community groups as resources to offer insights and experiences. In our programs, our cultural leaders engage in frank conversations with each other, framing challenges and identifying possible solutions that they can work on together. Some of our programs also offer study visits to the region, enabling our participants to interact with counterparts, for instance, in Malaysia and Indonesia. These opportunities for our cultural leaders to learn together contribute towards stronger inter-agency collaborations within our cultural sector. Looking forward, we want the Academy to become a node within Southeast Asia for nurturing cultural leaders. We would like to work closely with counterparts to bring the rich arts and cultural heritage of Southeast Asia to others beyond the region. The Academy will work on its capabilities to foster learning by providing a platform for researchers, academics and practitioners from Singapore or other countries who are interested to delve into research areas of mutual interest. Over time, we hope this allows us to build a rich database that can be tapped on by anyone wishing to learn more about professional cultural domains, and in particular, the arts and heritage of Southeast Asia. With rapid technological innovations, the Academy will also seek to leverage technology to expedite our work, making it more seamless in bringing arts, culture, and heritage to our diverse audiences. The conference today continues our journey to encourage research and nurture thought leadership. At a time of rapid change, many of our societies grapple with political and economic transformation, aging societies, emerging new technologies, and transmigration issues. It is a good time to discuss how the arts, culture, and heritage can help societies and governments to buffer the changes and displacements that come with these developments. This conference provides an opportunity to explore the nature of diverse communities and how culture can serve to inspire and connect us all. I want to thank our partners who have come on board to support this in many ways. I'm very pleased to note that we have grown our Culture Academy network from 18 in 2016 to 28 partners this year. We thank our eminent speakers and session moderators from overseas, as well as from Singapore, who readily accepted our invitation to speak and to moderate at the various panels. Our thanks also to the keynote speaker, Dr. David Fleming, for taking time to come to Singapore to share your thoughts on accessibility in the arts. And of course, again, thanks to that group of very special people we just heard from SOTA and from the MDA for that beautiful performance. We started this morning's program with that performance to show that the arts and culture brings diverse communities together and provides a level playing field. And thank you, Jeremiah Choi, for making this possible. And last but not least, we thank our guest of honor, SMS Sim-An, for taking time, despite your very busy schedule, to speak to us. I end by wishing all of us very exciting 2 days ahead of intellectual exchange and perhaps the start of more collaborations that can provide access for our diverse communities to enjoy the benefits that arts, culture, and heritage can bring. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Daniel. Now it gives me great pleasure to invite our guest of honor, Ms. Sim-An, Senior Minister of State, Ministry of Communications and Information, and the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, to deliver her address. SMS, please.
Before I begin, let me first apologize for the way I sound this morning. I've just lost my voice yesterday, but I'm getting it back slowly. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. It's my pleasure to join you today for the Culture Academy's Annual Conference 2018 to discuss accessibility for diverse communities, the role of cultural institutions. Accessibility is an important topic that has increasingly occupied the minds of policymakers, commentators, and philanthropic donors. Barriers, whether visible or invisible, can prevent people in society from enjoying the services and facilities intended to bring about improvements in their quality of life. In arts and culture, we need to remain conscientious in preventing the formation of such barriers or removing them where they are found. Only by doing so can Singaporeans from all backgrounds and walks of life be able to enjoy what the arts and culture can bring. This includes not just positive aesthetic experiences, but also a sense of belonging to our community, the development of strong friendships, and a good understanding of where we have come from and what we stand for today. At the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, we are committed to fostering a caring people, promoting a cohesive society, and developing a confident nation. Our arts and culture offerings support these efforts by giving us opportunities to reach out to and serve those who might be in less fortunate circumstances. They can also create environments where we can learn more about one another and share experiences as Singaporeans. Finally, our arts and culture reflect who we are as a nation and give us a sense of pride and rootedness. We want the arts and culture to be accessible to the widest audience possible so that it can enrich our lives and help us stand strong as a nation. Our commitment to improving accessibility through culture is clearly articulated in the National Arts Council's Our SG Arts Plan and the National Heritage Board's Our SG Heritage Plan. A key priority of our SG Arts Plan is to harness the potential of the arts for community building across cultures, generations, and socio-economic backgrounds, and to bring the arts to the underreached groups in society. Similarly, our SG Heritage Plan seeks to make our museums and their collections more accessible to the public and engage underserved communities in a meaningful manner through heritage programs co-developed with the community. These priorities are manifested through our program spaces and resources. For example, NAC's annual Arts in Your Neighborhood program in March and November provides opportunities for residents in our heartlands to appreciate and participate in music, dance, theatre, and visual arts activities in a community setting. To cater to underserved communities, NAC also organized 2 Singapore Writers' Festival events in 2018 to provide opportunities for children with special needs to engage with the arts alongside their peers. On NHB's part, its Heritage Cares initiative includes a range of activities such as guided tours of heritage trails, hands-on workshops, and interactive programs for the elderly and children from low-income families. Since its launch in March 2016, over 400 programs have been organized, engaging more than 3,000 volunteers and serving over 13,000 participants. In addition, NHB is currently taking steps to ensure that our museums and heritage institutions are inclusive social spaces. For example, NHB is conducting an accessibility audit that will review all aspects of accessibility, from the physical to the intangible, such as how well our exhibitions cater to the diverse needs of visitors. NHB will also continue to support more ground-up placemaking efforts at heritage precincts such as the Civic District, Little India, Kampong Glam and Chinatown to facilitate more inter-community understanding of our shared heritage. Both NAC and NHB have also made resources available to encourage volunteers to take ownership of and promote our arts and heritage to the wider community. Since its launch in July 2018, 1,200 of NAC's Befriender Arts Toolkit have been distributed to over 800 befrienders from 16 social service organizations who have in turn reached out to more than 1,100 beneficiaries. Similarly, NHB's Conversation Starter Kit for seniors has been distributed to over 60 elder care centres across Singapore with requests for more kids coming in. The government's efforts alone are not sufficient to bring our arts and heritage to everyone and everywhere. We are fortunate that we have committed partners who are equally passionate about increasing the accessibility of our arts and culture offerings. A few months ago, I attended a very interesting community engagement project presented by Drama Box, Arts Walk Collaborative, the Lian Foundation, and Ang Chinmo Foundation, which touched on end-of-life issues. Led by Artistic Director Kwok the project saw the team reaching out directly to the community through participatory arts activities, installations, and dialogue sessions. I was impressed by how the arts transformed what some viewed as a taboo topic into something that people could come together to proactively discuss. This exemplifies the potential of the arts in bringing together different groups, helping us engage with difficult issues, and being the richer for it. I hope to see more such partners working with us to reach out to different communities in Singapore through the arts and culture. Beyond our shores, there is also an opportunity for our cultural institutions to work with overseas partners to exchange views, share best practices, and learn from one another's experiences. Later this morning, NHB will be signing an MOU with the University of Melbourne, which aims to help both partners develop new capabilities. In implementing this MOU, I hope that NHB and the University of Melbourne will consider how they can work together to ensure greater accessibility in their cultural offerings. We have made some progress in increasing accessibility to and through arts and heritage. Nevertheless, I'm sure much more remains to be done. This conference is an opportunity to learn about where we may have done well and where we can still improve. I wish everyone a productive and enjoyable next 2 days exploring these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, SMS. Thank you, SMS, for delivering the speech. Even with your voice, we wish you a speedy recovery. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. David Fleming, Chair in Public History, Liverpool Hope University. I'd first like to invite the moderator for this session, Dr. Kenson Kwok, Founding Director of Asian Civilisations Museum, to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Kwok, please.
Good morning to all of you. I have the pleasant task of introducing our keynote speaker. David Fleming is a leading authority on inclusivity in museums. He's currently, as our MC told us, Professor of Public History at Liverpool Hope University in the UK. He was a director, he was a director at various museums for more than 25 years, most recently of National Museums Liverpool, where he was responsible for huge audience growth and the creation of 2 acclaimed new museums, the Museum of Liverpool and the International Slavery Museum. David has headed 2 ICOM committees, Intercom, Committee on Museum Management and Leadership, and the Finance and Resources Committee. He's also currently president of the Federation of International Human Rights Museums. He has published extensively and lectured in 50 countries on museum management, tourism, ethics, social history, urban history, slavery, and human rights. David was in Singapore in October for the ICOM Symposium on Museum Definitions. It's great to have you back so soon. Please join me now to welcome Professor Fleming to give us the keynote.
Thank you so much, Kenson. Senior Minister and distinguished guests, I would like to start just by saying a few words of thanks to the organisers of this conference. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for inviting me here. And I would particularly like to thank Pei Jun, Zhe Ying, excuse my pronunciation, and of course, Rosa Daniel. Oh. I hope that's not broken it. And I would also like to acknowledge the inspiring performance that opened the conference by Muscular Dystrophy Association of Singapore. Oh, maybe it did break. And the School of the Arts. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And also thank you to Thangama for organising everything so well. Excuse me. So, to business. I've got about 20 minutes, and then we have questions which will be hosted by Kenson, I think. So please do use your Pigeonhole. Now, those of us from different parts of the world had never seen Pigeonhole before October, and I was completely knocked out by it. It's a fantastic system that I think everybody should use all the time, but there's limited knowledge about it. And it's a metaphor really for museums. Now, museums the world over are facing a host of challenges, many of which are new to them. In particular, museums are being required far more than ever before to demonstrate that they're used widely by diverse audiences. I should say that while my comments are largely directed at museums, because that's my background, most of what I have to say is entirely applicable right across the cultural sector. So when I use the term museums, please assume that I'm talking about culture in general. No one is excluded. Excuse me. Museums need to ensure that no one is excluded from what they do, and they're being challenged to be far more permeable than ever before. A word which I heard at a lunch discussion yesterday, which I think is perfect for summing up the way that cultural institutions now need to be. They need to be permeable. They need to be open for business to everybody, not just to themselves. Now, there are two principal reasons for this. I think, firstly, as society's needs grow more complex and as the public voice grows ever louder and more demanding, not least because of the extraordinary power of social media, museums need to ensure that they're not left behind and be seen as irrelevant to too many people. And this does not simply mean keeping up with technological change. Secondly, especially for those museums excuse me, that are in receipt of public funding, museums need to ensure that they're seen by society as worth funding at a time when there is global pressure on public spending and increasing competition. No longer are museums able to assume that they are viewed by society at large as a public good that simply has to be funded. On the contrary, those museums that fail to show their value to society will disappear. There's a third factor at play in helping museums modernise their ways of behaving, which is the changes in the nature of the museum workforce itself. The workforce has grown in numbers, it's increased in its diversity. There are more women and younger people have taken charge of museums. These changes have led to a wave of enthusiasm for social history and community history, and to an increased respect for community life, community involvement, community access and democracy. Also, the museum workforce is increasingly professional and less amateurish. Museum staff are better trained and better at managing, and I think this applies again right across the cultural sector. And so the traditional museum, the one which measured its excellence solely in terms of scholarship and knowledge, the one which didn't really care whether or not it had a broad relevance, is, I would say, finished. Its day is over. Modern museums have to show that in rejecting this way of behaving, then they remain something that has broad social value beyond that of merely being well-managed institutions that are of economic value in tourism terms. This is not so easy when funders everywhere are panicking in the face of insufficient public funding and are pressing museums to earn as much income as they can in order to reduce the pressure on the public purse, thus opening up ever greater possibilities of corporate interests and populist politicians influencing, if not dominating, what museums say, in a world where commercial competition and political values are quite clearly overpowering cultural values. Successful museums are those that are able to combine great scholarship with public accessibility, without simply spouting everything that funders may demand or want to hear. That are able to retain the trust placed in them so often by the public. Museums bear a heavy responsibility in this respect, and we must not betray the public by kowtowing to whomever has most money in his or her pockets. An example of this is the museum which deals with environmental matters. The public expects to learn about the environment from a museum, not just to see the propaganda of fossil fuel companies. And so we walk a tightrope because we certainly need money to survive and prosper, but some people in museums seem to think that they are the only ones who ought to be able to use public funding in order to express their opinions. I think that we've gone beyond the point of society being able to place our whole trust in museums and what they say, even though many people do still hold museums in high regard. And so the biggest challenge for museums that wish to stay in business and at the same time to increase their perceived value to society is to welcome to their tables dissent and different points of public view rather than to try to pretend that they have an inalienable and eternal right to survive simply because they represent some kind of high point in cultural life that everyone ought to respect. Museums have to behave in a socially responsible fashion. I think that a recognition of this lies at the heart of the answer to the question of how museums ensure that they are accessible. They have to be valued above all else, and modern values are not the same as they used to be, when museums perhaps enjoyed a relatively untouchable role as guardians of knowledge, wisdom, and truth. As a result of this modernisation of museums, of this new way of thinking, there has been a shift in the balance between objects and stories in museums. Museums have become less obsessed with the internal mechanics of looking after collections and have grown into a more extrovert role. They have become more socially responsible. Now, museums have lots of roles. I think we can usefully divide museum roles into three broad headings. There's research and collecting, the most traditional role, beloved of academics and conservatives. There's the economic role, tourism and job creation, which is beloved of politicians. And then there's the social role, which is audience-focused, educational, community-orientated, democratic, open to debate, diverse, and over and above all, socially responsible. This is beloved of the public. Let's consider more closely what being socially responsible means for museums and what it implies for the way we behave. Different museums in different places play different roles, depending upon all sorts of variables: content of collections, location, resources available, type of visitors, and so on. Some museums are of purely local importance. Some cater almost exclusively for tourists. Some are object-rich. Others rely heavily on film. Some deal with nature, others with art, others ancient history, others modern history, others manufacturing, others people. In truth, no two museums are the same. But museums which are socially responsible all have one thing in common. They have a passion to create social value. They're not satisfied with collecting, preservation, and research. They do value these activities. A museum which does not value these things is illogical and absurd. But a socially responsible museum regards these as techniques and means rather than as ends in themselves. The socially responsible museum has at its core a powerful commitment to education. It also has a powerful conscience. The museum is committed to an agenda which rejects the notion that museums are restricted preserves. The museum wants to reach out, to locate and engage with all manner of constituencies. In particular, it wants to engage with people who suffer from some form of disadvantage or discrimination, whether that be economic, social or personal, which renders them vulnerable. The socially responsible museum sees itself as valuable to all, not just to a few, and it will go out of its way through positive action to fulfill this inclusive mission. Positive action means that the museum is joining the fight against social exclusion, joining with other socially responsible agencies to effect a difference at the personal, community and social levels. In other words, social responsibility means being socially inclusive, which leads ultimately to social value and the attainment of social justice. That's our primary aim, I would argue. Without social value, without achieving social justice, museums aren't worth having in the first place. So, what are national museums doing in the Museum of Liverpool? And you can see the Museum of Liverpool, it's the whitest of the buildings on there. There are a number of whitish buildings, but it's the whitest building, it's the modern building on the extreme right of the picture. As well as a deep diversity, Liverpool has 4 generations suffered from chronic economic decline, so that today the population is only half of what it was in the 1930s. It was once one of the world's richest cities, and probably the world's most successful port. The city went into severe decline between the 2 world wars, and by the 1980s there were real fears for Liverpool's future. Central government had to step in to rescue the city. Now, Liverpool recently appears to have turned the corner, and regeneration finally began, with new shops, new hotels, new restaurants, new jobs, to add to the city's unmatched cultural offer. It was an unmatched cultural offer because of the wealth of the city, which had been built up but 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. So nonetheless, unemployment is still high, and Liverpool and neighbouring Knowsley are ranked as the 2 most deprived areas in England, with Liverpool topping the rankings of deprivation. The point is that the socio-economic condition of Liverpool and the surrounding area along with the nature of the museum collections, are defining factors in how the museum service organises itself. So in terms of museum usage, National Museums Liverpool has a powerful commitment to achieving total inclusion of local people, sees itself primarily as a socially responsible museum service. Now, I have lots of pictures of action at the National Museums Liverpool, which I guess I've got a few minutes to talk about. What we're looking at here is the outside of the International Slavery Museum, which we grandiosely claim is setting the truth free. What we mean by that is that much history of slavery has been swept under the carpet, as we say in England. It's ignored. I was brought up in a number of schools in England, and I learned nothing about the transatlantic slave trade, of which Britain was the main progenitor and main funder. So in the International Slavery Museum, it's an overtly anti-racist institution. It's not ambivalent about racism, it's against racism, and it wants visitors to leave the museum feeling that they've learnt something that they didn't know before they went in, and that maybe racism is a bad thing. The museum will not provide all the answers. I think museums have overstretched in the past. They assume that people want to leave the museum complete with a degree in history or whatever it might be. And that's not the case. But have you changed them a little bit? Have you made them want to think? Have you made them want to learn more? That's what the Great Museum can do. This is a very uncompromising museum, as you can see from this slide here. It pulls no punches. It was controversial. There are people of African descent who live in Liverpool, and it's a very old community of black people living in Liverpool, like we have a very old community of people of Chinese descent living in Liverpool. Why? Because it was a great port, because lots of people used to come to the city on ships and stay there. So it's very cosmopolitan in that respect. But when we said that we wanted to create an international slavery museum, it was designed to look at slavery in all its forms at all times, in all parts of the world, not just at transatlantic slavery. So there were people of African descent, there were black Liverpudlians who complained about this idea. They said that it would divert from the notion that transatlantic slave trade was a bad thing. Our counter-argument was that if you are to engage particularly younger people who often turn up at the museum knowing nothing and thinking very little, it would appear to me, and I include my daughter in this, and I include myself as a younger person. I need some intellectual stimulation. I need to know what's going on. I need to have my eyes opened. That's what the International Slavery Museum tries to do, and it tries to open people's eyes to the iniquities of racism and the nonsensical issues that are behind people who believe in racism. But it's very important that we carry people with us. There's no point in the museum just sitting there and preaching to everybody. So on Slavery Remembrance Day, which is August the 23rd every year, we have Slavery Remembrance Day march through the centre of Liverpool, joined by lots of people of all creeds, beliefs, ethnicities, and so on and so forth, all demonstrating their belief that the fight against racism is one that's worth pursuing, led by the International Slavery Museum. Kenson mentioned that museum, and he mentioned this museum, the Museum of Liverpool, which is the latest creation in the city, and it's the one where I think we've probably seen most perfectly the road to how the accessible museum behaves. And now, a while ago, I was asked by the BBC, so, okay, what makes this a successful museum? This is the essence of what I said to them. I said, it is ambitious, it's people and story-led. This was a great amazement to the BBC, who expected me to be some scholarly person who could only talk about Assyrian artifacts. But I was talking about people and stories. And this is what, it gives us a lot in common with broadcasters and with journalists. And it makes the museum of surprising relevance to people, which is what we need to do if we are to be truly accessible. I said that the museum had an authentic Liverpool voice. This is very deliberate. It's a museum of Liverpool, in Liverpool, by the people of Liverpool. It's not the same as a museum would be in Singapore or indeed anywhere else in the world. And it's very important that we understand that museums everywhere are different from museums everywhere else. It has to be of the place. We had empathetic partners, very important. In fact, if you don't have empathetic partners, you're going to go nowhere. The old-fashioned traditional 19th century model of museums were very insular and inward-looking. They didn't really have partnerships, but now that's the name of the game. You have to find people to work with, otherwise you'll go nowhere. It takes families seriously, and by that, I've often wondered what I meant when I said this. What I mean is different generations talking to each other about what's going on. There's been a great deal of interest in our work with seniors, with older people in Liverpool. In common with every other nation on the planet, we're all living longer. The issues of people growing old in greater numbers are pressing on all of us. What can museums do about that? The answer is museums are the perfect place to help rekindle identity among people. And part of what the museum tries to do is to give a form of respect back to people who may have even forgotten who they are and where they come from. That's what dementia does to people. Living with dementia is a tricky set of issues. Nonetheless, museums can be absolutely central to how to cope with all those issues. The museum has great variety. Now, any decent museum has variety, but is it also changeable? Or do we spend lots of money on creating something and we're never able to raise that money again, so it never changes? That's the traditional museum. I remember going to museums in Leeds when I was a young child, and they never changed. Over decades, nothing ever altered. Why would I keep going back there? Nothing was ever different. And lastly, and possibly most important of all, museums must be emotional places. Make them laugh, make them cry. Interestingly, is a quote from P.T. Barnum, who is the subject of the film The Greatest Showman. And we saw a performance about what Barnum was up to earlier on. He was the first person to say, if you want to engage the public, make them laugh, make them cry. It's something which has entered the canon, and we've almost forgotten who it was that first said it. But this is exactly what museums need to do. We need to learn from successful businesses like Disney. We don't need to behave like Disney, because I don't suppose there's any Disney executives here, but I would say that the educational value of Disney is zero. The educational value of museums is very high, but there are things to learn, because Disney places are absolutely stuffed, crammed full of exactly the kind of people that we want to visit museums. Why is that? Because it's emotional, it's fun, it's entertaining, and we need to learn techniques from what those guys do, while at the same time ensuring that we remain of more educational value than they would ever pretend to aspire to. Okay. Some more shots from the Museum of Liverpool. This is part of the gallery called East Meets West, and it's actually Liverpool and its relationships with the Chinese city of Shanghai. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that she'd been to Shanghai not so long ago and believed that part of it looked just like Liverpool. Well, actually, it's true. Part of it does look just like Liverpool, because part of Shanghai, the famous Bund, the old part of the Shanghai waterfront, is based on the buildings in Liverpool. And it dates back, well, that certainly is about 100 years ago. I think the buildings in Liverpool are Edwardian, the Bund is slightly later. Nonetheless, the relationships are long-term. And this is a gallery which absolutely feeds into the idea that there are people of Chinese descent living in Liverpool. Very easy to ignore them, because most of them speak Cantonese. They don't even speak Mandarin. So it's difficult to communicate with people in China. It's even more difficult to communicate with people in Liverpool if you only speak Cantonese, and many people do. So the museum has developed a special relationship with people of Chinese descent in the city of Liverpool. One of the great mysteries to museums is why they don't get teenage girls interested. Why would my daughter is a teenage girl. The last thing she normally would want to think of doing would be to ever visit a museum. But there are certain things in which she's interested. If the museum can identify what those might be and find some way of dealing with it, then maybe, just maybe, she'll want to visit. So there's an exhibition where we involved local teenage young women in designing costume for, I don't want to turn into cliche and stereotype here, but sometimes that's exactly where you go in order to make contact with people. Let's not be too precious about what we think people are interested in. If they're interested in one direction, or whoever it might be, then let's accept that. Let's not be sniffy and superior about it and say, oh no, you really ought to be listening to Mozart and Beethoven and Bach and so on and so forth. That's not what my daughter wants to do, you know. So if the museum wants to communicate with her, it must learn to use her language. The Museum of Liverpool has ranged across a number of issues, and one of the points I want to make is that cultural activity, it takes time to be able to engage with lots and lots and lots and lots of different types of people, with lots of different interest groups. It doesn't all happen tomorrow, and one of the problems that we have, one of the pressures that we're under, is that politicians who provide our funding often want to see it happen all tomorrow, and it doesn't work like that. So this is something where we need to develop a heightened level of understanding about how the cultural sector is able to engage with lots and lots of different groups. It's taken us years to build a relationship with the LGBTQ community in and around Liverpool. But now that community or representatives of that group of people trust the museum. They can see what we're doing. They can see that their eyes are open to all sorts of people, many of whom might have originally been hostile. So here's an example of that kind of work. I've heard a lot in Singapore. I'm beginning to conclude that there is almost an obsession in this nation with special needs. And access and diversity is about a lot more than special needs. It's an important part, but it's not everything that there is to do. Having said that, here we have people who live with Down syndrome in a theatre group, and their main way of communicating with everybody else is through the museum. It's not through their group, because nobody goes to their group, except people like them and their relatives. But lots of people come to the museum, and that's the magic of the cultural sector, that we have these great big broad audiences, or do we? We should do, because then people get the chance to find their voice properly. I think, oh no, it's not the last slide, but think piece, act piece. Activism is an important part of what the modern museum should do. We have this faux neutrality idea that museums are places where you go to learn something and it's devoid of any kind of opinion and bias. And nothing could be more dishonest, it seems to me. I concluded yesterday while having lunch that I'm going to write, my next paper will be called The Dishonest Museum, and it's all about museums that pretend that they're not part of the world, that somewhere there is a director who's pulling the strings and calling the shots without saying so. It's absolutely dishonest. Even every museum in the world is run by people. All people have opinions and biases. That's the truth. That's the way the world works. So it doesn't matter what you're a director of, your own views will be manifest in that institution. And my own view is that the more activist and political we are, the more likely we are to find ourselves of some relevance to the people who live around us, instead of trying to pretend that we live in some strange academic world where the truth is absolute and most people don't have any form of understanding about it. Children are a very important part of the normal world. Museums and children often don't mix. And sometimes when museums try very hard to engage younger children, they're regarded dismissively by academics and scholars. This is absolutely quite wrong. So we need to take children seriously, and children's needs and children's learning abilities and so on very seriously. And lastly, the House of Memories is our dementia programme. I think that the biggest call on the public health sector in Britain nowadays is dealing with mental health issues among older people. But the cultural sector is the perfect place to engage for so many reasons. I can talk more about House of Memories if anybody's interested. I've almost finished. We have recognised that museums do have many roles. They have many different impacts or outcomes. This means that they're full of potential, but they do need to move away from traditional thinking in order to fulfil this potential. This causes stress in some museums because not all museum people are able or willing to break with traditional thinking. Nonetheless, it's essential that museums play their full role in society, not least because this is the way to help protect and enhance public funding for museums. Despite the deeply ingrained tendency to excuse me, to focus inwardly. Museums now take education and learning much more seriously than they used to do, and are acting in a far more socially responsible way than they ever used to. This is a process which has been underway on a worldwide scale for a generation or more. It's resulted in a variety of developments in museum attitudes, structures, behaviours and skills. In a socially responsible museum, we see tackle difficult contemporary issues, as I've hinted at in these pictures of what goes on in the Museum of Liverpool and the International Slavery Museum. Issues such as homelessness or prostitution or gay rights and sexuality, disability issues, ethnicity, migration and human rights in general. We see politics being faced up to in the popular accessible museum. In the social responsible accessible museum, we see audience research and programs are devised accordingly. The public is listened to. We know and care about who our users are. In the accessible museum, it's recognized that without access, there can be no learning. So the broadest view of access is taken, not just the physical, but the intellectual, not just the program, but the promotion, not just the message, but the medium. The diversity of communities is appropriately represented in such museums. But there is more that needs to be done. The socially responsible museum needs to be networked on a grand scale. It has scores, perhaps hundreds, of community, cultural and educational partnerships that provide new ideas, contacts, information, audiences and confidence, and they often can enable the museum to shortcut to the relationships based on trust, which is so important when museums attempt to work with socially excluded people. The socially responsible museum needs to be a listening organisation. It goes almost without saying that free access to museums, including to special exhibitions, it is a key component in its ability to behave in a socially responsible fashion. The cost of running museums is not inconsiderable, but often the contribution made to costs through levying an admission charge is far outweighed by a museum's failure to attract people from a low-income background. It's something to think about this, because many politicians believe that if you introduce admission charges, it defrays the cost, it reduces the costs. Actually, there may be far greater social costs in terms of excluding people. So everywhere we need to think about that. Even in the USA, a place where it's difficult to get anything free. Everything costs money in the USA, but even there, museums have been agonizing for years over whether or not they might be more purposeful if only they did not have to levy an admission charge. It's a very interesting debate, which I think will be explored during the course of this conference. So these are just a few thoughts on the social responsibility and accessibility of museums, in particular of the new Museum of Liverpool, and on the need for museums to pursue a social justice agenda, if they wish to be accessible in the fullest sense. In order to become socially responsible, I argue that museums and cultural institutions need fundamentally to rethink how we manage ourselves and how we perceive our value. We need to rethink these ancient values that we carry around with us if we are to engage with the whole of society. This is happening, but not without pain and disagreement, as museums and cultural sector worldwide continue to modernise. I'd like to finish this presentation by quoting from the first edition of Museums Change Lives. I've only brought a copy of the first edition and a copy of the second edition. If you want more, I'm sure that can be arranged through the organisers. It's a publication by the UK Museums Association. It's the UK Museums Association's vision for the increased social impact of museums. And among the key points made in this document are the following. Everyone has the right to meaningful participation in the life and work of museums. Audiences are creators as well as consumers of knowledge. Their insights and expertise enrich and transform the museum experience for others. Active public participation changes museums for the better. Effective museums engage with contemporary issues, and museums are not, repeat, not neutral spaces. So museums need to be relevant, they need to be emotional, they need to behave differently from how they used to. This applies right across the cultural sector. They may well need to be activist, like the Slavery Museum and the Museum of Liverpool, if they wish to be truly accessible. I think at that point I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. I'd like to invite you to the seat. I'd like to invite Dr. Kenson, Kwok back to join Dr. Fleming for the question and answer session. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I'd like to remind you of Pigeonhole. So please feel free to submit your questions. I've seen some questions on the Pigeonhole. Feel free to upvote any questions which you think should be answered by our moderator as well as Dr. Fleming. If not, we also have microphones. So if you like microphones, you can raise your hands. We will give you the microphones, but please remember to identify yourself. So without further ado, I'll hand the time over to Dr. Kwok, please.
I'd like to say that if some of you don't want to use Pigeonhole, by all means raise your hands and ask questions in the traditional way. Can I kick off with a question to you, Dave? Yeah, we've got quite a few coming in, but just give it a few more minutes. In fact, I've got several questions, but I'll just keep it to one for the time being. You said that museums are not neutral. And museums should be open to all voices, including dissent and different points of view. Given that some voices might not be entirely altruistic, what kinds of skills or resources are needed in museums to manage such transactions? And how can we bring people with different views together rather than inadvertently deepening the divisions between them?
Okay, well, that's not difficult to answer. The thing is that I'm not asking museums to do anything differently from what they've ever done before. I'm asking them to be more open about the fact that people like you and I call the shots when we're directing a museum staff. Our personal values are involved in the museum. There was a time when that used to be a closely kept secret, and it mustn't be any longer. And this is what I mean by saying that museums are never neutral. They are always, no matter what kind of museum it is, always representative of somebody and what somebody thinks. Even what's on show, what isn't on show, what's collected, what isn't collected, what's preserved, what isn't preserved. So I don't think I'm asking for anything brand new there. I'm just looking for more honesty and more openness. And I think that the world, if we wish to engage everybody, we have to do more than worry about, I don't know, how the Assyrians used to ride around in chariots and what their weaponry was like. We have to engage with contemporary issues. And contemporary issues which are on people's minds include some of what we've already seen and heard today. They include issues like migration and ethnicity and religion and warfare and politics and so on and so forth. This is what people have come to expect from, certainly from the media, and I don't see any reason why cultural institutions think that somehow they are entitled to avoid these kind of discussions. As to whether it leads to greater divisions in society, I think that's for society to decide. I don't think it's for the museum director to decide that, oh, that's a tricky old issue, I'm going to avoid that because it might cause problems somewhere. I think that if you go to, I'm not going to name any particular museum, but if you go to some of the tourist venues in Western Europe, what you will see are the views of the directors of those museums, but they're being very covert about it. In avoiding politics, for example, they're making a conscious decision to avoid being political. Why? Probably because they're frightened of the fact that often it's politicians who provide funding. And yet it's a ridiculous notion that anywhere in the world nowadays can go its own way and ignore the fact that the world is constantly changing all around us.
Can I follow up with another one related to that last point? A few months, or earlier this year, Nick Serota, formerly of Tate, said something about how publicly funded museums will inevitably be seen as reflecting establishment values. How can museums be more inclusive without coming into conflict with these establishment values?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a risk, and indeed Nick Serota is a person that has lived through the idea of spending public money and yet supposedly being an independent mind and an independent voice. And the public looks to people like Nick Serota to provide the counter argument. They feel they have a relationship with him, they feel they have a relationship with art gallery directors. They're not expecting to have a direct relationship with the people who provide the funding. And this is one of the problems of keeping modern cultural institutions going. We all need money. and the risk is that we start dancing to the tune of the people that provide the money. Now, that might be a government. Not all governments are as positive and hands-off as they ought to be. Some are much more involved. Or it might mean going to commercial sector, and we've had some very great controversies in the cultural sector about the commercial businesses trying to control our message to people. I don't think that's the deal. I think the public responds very badly to that. And we've seen instances of particularly with fossil fuel companies supporting cultural activity. And yet, what the fossil fuel companies, what some of them are looking for, is a pro-fossil fuel agenda from the cultural institutions. I don't think the public expects that that's the way cultural institutions will behave. As to the establishment...
That's where you get a situation where there's loss of trust, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think, but my worry is that we can become over-reliant and overly trusting of the people who direct these institutions, because they are just as likely to be, I don't know, fascistic and racist as anybody else is. Then what? And often people have said to me in the past, yes, it's all very well, applying a humanitarian, liberal view approach to your museum, but what happens when the fascists are in control and they start doing the same? My answer is, well, that's been happening anyway, so I'm not going to start worrying about it now.
So let's turn now to questions from the audience. The one with the highest votes is, who is accountable to curate the voice for cultural institutions, given the multiple stakeholders and finders at play?
Well, I mean, the answer is whoever's in charge, and that begs the question of who appoints the people and to whom are they responsible. But we mustn't ever ignore the fact that human beings are human beings. We all have our biases and our prejudices, and sometimes we're good guys and sometimes we're not so good guys, and sometimes we're open and honest about things and sometimes we're not. That's life. You've kind of got to get on with it. There's no such thing as neutrality and avoidance of a point of view. There's always a point of view on display, wherever it might be, right across the cultural sector.
All right, let's go on to the next one. See what you make of this, David. Where do museums draw the line from being accessible to becoming institutions that cater to fads in speaking the same lingo to reach out to new audiences? I'm not quite sure I understand that one.
Well,
about fads.
It suggests that that's not always been the case. That's always been the case. There's nothing new about what I'm saying. Sometimes we've avoided contentious issues because they're too difficult, and we're in search of this faux neutrality. All I'm saying nowadays is if we can be a bit more open and honest about the fact that we want to be inclusive, we want everybody to come along and use the museums rather than them being places that super serve a highly educated, well-off elite. And that has been a problem right across the cultural sector, ever since the cultural sector was described as a cultural sector. It's always been a problem. All of us have exactly the same issue. Aging audiences. I mean, the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra is worried that the only people that visit are all quite elderly. The grey community, what happens when they're dead? Are the young people ever going to keep going? Is it a sustainable model? I'm not too sure, but for sure it won't be a sustainable model if all the orchestra does is super serve those grey-haired people. It's got to do things differently if it wants to survive into the future. So I think the problem with the question is that behind the question lies the idea that the public will value us if we don't join in with the normal run of life. If we think there's a refuge in academia and scholarship, we're quite wrong. It won't happen. We will disappear. I think that those days are finished and over, and it's time that we acknowledge that.
I think I'm interpreting this question as a kind of a worry about dumbing down. I think this is what this question is about.
Yeah, I think it's an important issue, and you have to trust people like us not to dumb down. You have to trust us that we will maintain standards of scholarship. The point I'm making is that we mustn't only do that. We have to learn techniques, particularly from the entertainment sector, if we think that we're going to be of relevance to broad audiences. If we're not interested in broad audiences, by all means, let's keep behaving like we always did. Let's not dumb down, let's not run the risk of dumbing down at all. But there's a fundamental dishonesty in that, and most people, like in Italy, for example, I think 70% of the population in Italy never visit a museum. That's an outrageous... Imagine what politicians think of that. They look at that and think 70% of people never visit a museum. Why on earth are we funding these places?
Given that they've got tens of thousands of museums in that country.
Well, you know, the risk is that all that happens is that Italian museums become full of tourists, full of people from elsewhere in the world, and no Italians ever go. That's the risk. And I don't think we need to dumb down to attract Italians. I think that's very disrespectful of the way that society thinks. I think that we can be much more intelligent and creative, and that's the skill set that we need to develop. Not worry over much about dumbing down as though there's, you know, that's it's good enough for those people, and we're not going to do it because it's beneath us. We've got to be able to meet halfway, but we've got to be intelligent about it.
In my own experience, I learned that one should never underestimate an audience. You know, if something is good, they know it, and they will come. So, you know, you shouldn't underestimate the audience. There's the next one. I think it relates to your example about the teenagers. It says, you mentioned that museums and children often don't mix. I think they mean the teenagers. And how can we engage children without losing the educational and social values that museums want to impart to them? I think you answered that question with your example on the teenagers.
I think so. I mean, it's a very well-known fact that, particularly in museums, and I suspect it's the same right across the cultural sector, you might be okay dealing with small children, but then you lose them when they get to the age of about 12, 13. They start being interested in different things. Then maybe they'll come back again when they're young adults. But there's a whole generation of people missing that I used to think, it's too much like hard work. I'm not even going to bother with them because I don't have the resources to be able to cope with difficult, demanding teenagers. And yet, if you want total accessibility, that's exactly what you must do. It's possible to do. It's possible to get my daughter interested. She's motivated by issues about the environment. She's motivated by issues about human rights, for example. Just for example, these are not trivial, dumbed-down issues. These are very important issues, and at our peril do we decide that we are the only people capable of defining what a quality experience looks like.
Do you, on that issue, did you have audience research sessions with different communities to find out what kind of topics would interest them? I
think one of the secrets of the success of National Museums Liverpool, and I should say it's a place where audiences increased 500% on a fixed budget. Well, I say 500%. The statisticians tell me it's more like 400%. But they went up from 700,000 a year to 3.5 million a year on a fixed budget. One of the reasons for that is that we learned much more about our audiences and potential audiences by doing exhaustive interviews with people all the time. And you don't just learn about what they want to see, because you don't just necessarily respond to, well, what does everybody want to see? They all want to see exhibitions about sex, or the Chinese Emperor's Warriors, or the Beatles, or whatever it might be. And the Intelligent Museum has a much more constructive role in life than simply doing what everybody wants it to do. That's not what I'm saying. But we find out what their interests are, we find out what they read, what motivates them, where they live, where they come from, what their socio-economic background and status might be. And the museum itself decided that it wanted to become more activist. The public responded in ever greater numbers. But it's certainly true that I think the cultural sector at large can learn a lot from what audiences think. And I'm not just talking about this faux democracy of populism, of going and following the line of least resistance. This is the point of having skilled people working in, and well-trained people working and managing the cultural sector. But we have to accept that if we don't know our audiences, we've no idea what to do next. When I first went to Liverpool in 2001, I said, you appear to do no audience research here. How do you know what to do tomorrow? as a result? You know, what are the imperatives driving the decision-making in this place? It's clearly not the audience, so what is it? A rhetorical question.
Do you see that with this changing role of museums, that new kinds of museum professionals might be useful, might be required to manage all these different transactions with various communities?
I think, well, it's an interesting question that I don't think the need for knowledge and scholarship will ever disappear. That's not what I'm arguing for. What I'm saying is that we need to add to those skills. And I think people who are great communicators are an increasingly valuable asset in any kind of cultural setup. So we have to strike a balance between Disneyfying and becoming brainless and clueless and with no educational value at all, but being empty, you know, having no public there, because the public would far rather be doing something else than coming along to see what we highly educated people regard as worthy. And therefore, I think that we need a great range of skills in the cultural sector now that's very different from what we used to be. This is what I mean by our values changing. Right. We used to measure the success and credibility of a cultural institution, a great art gallery, purely on scholarship. And now I think it's much more, is it a great communication device? That's the way that we should be measuring. And if it's not a great communication device, then it needs to become one. Otherwise, it will disappear in future. That's my point.
Okay, this leads on to the next most popular question, which is one I had for you as well. Could you share some of the indicators for measuring impact within cultural institutions?
Impact is very difficult to measure in any form of educational environment, because, you know, without an examination to judge people at the end, and, you know, let's not even go there about the way that politicians change the rules sometimes about education. But essentially, what you are wanting to do is you are wanting to change people who come to the museum. So I think finding measurements has plagued us, and it's become an excuse to avoid doing that kind of thing, and it's become a pretext for museums to pretend that, oh, well, you know, we're very scholastic, therefore our measurements are all based around how many articles we publish in a year and so on and so forth. And I think that the best measurements that we had in Liverpool was to look at the makeup of the audience and find out who was coming and show the differences that we were making. So we got to the point where we were clearly appealing to people from a far lower income background than we had used to formerly. To me, that's a great indicator of something going right. But it's not easy.
Sure. Do you track whether people come back and whether it's a second or third visit? Or I think this is quite crucial. We
try to do that without asking every single person that ever
Sure.
comes, because the museums in Liverpool are all free access. But you do ask questions, and you do discover that people come back time and time again, particularly local people. Yeah. And that's one of the things that doesn't happen in a place that has a significant admission charge. People don't return very, very often. There are people that go almost daily to the museums in Liverpool because they're free to go into, so you can wander in at will. And that's exactly the kind of environment that you would like to create. If you have to have an admission charge, that's fair enough if that's the only way that you can keep going. But let's not pretend that it's not a barrier to access. It is a barrier to access. It's a barrier to people on low incomes if you have an admission charge. You can come up with all sorts of devices to cope with that, but the issue is it is clearly a barrier to access. And if politicians are interested in value for money, value for what they spend money on, and politicians vote for money on all sorts of things, but the cultural sector has to be able to demonstrate that people value what the spend is going on.
But there's also thinking that, with charges, that if there's a charge, which may not be a significant one, then people value what they're paying for.
Yes, I've heard this very often. I'm not quite sure. I think it's a way of excusing the fact that there has to be a charge. I think it's possible to have free activity that is highly valued by people. It depends on the quality of what it is that you're doing. If it's rubbish, if it's an parks, for example, are often usually free to go into. You wander into a park, but you don't go into a park if it's full of dog muck and dangerous people and dangerous dogs. You don't go there. It's free, but the quality is awful, so you don't use it. So, you know, free does not equal high quality. The magic trick is to try to be as cheap, as inexpensive, free as possible, and to have high quality. And that requires a particular skill set and a particular set of attitudes in the people that work there. That's all it requires.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. How does Museums of Liverpool prioritize the needs and interests of different groups? For example, older versus newer communities, and what kinds of tensions did it need to address? It's
a good question, because you can't do everything at the same time. You never have the resources to do everything at the same time. And I remember when the Museum of Liverpool opened, we had a particular feature looking at people of Welsh descent in the city. And we had all sorts of rows with people of Irish descent and Scottish descent and Jewish descent, Chinese, Indian. Lots of people from different backgrounds who self-define themselves as from that background wanted to know why are you dealing with the Welsh? Why are they in the museum? Answer, your turn will come. So it doesn't happen on day one. You have to judge a museum over a period, not just on one single visit. So that was the way that we used to do that. You move around. There are things that you can't do everything at the same time. There's not space, there's not resource, there's not the staff knowledge, and so on and so forth. So you have to judge a place over a period. And I find this hard to get through to people that don't just visit the museum on one day and imagine that it will never change again. It's changing on a fairly frequent basis, as frequently as you can afford to change it. So when we opened the Museum of Liverpool, the very first special show that we had of Liverpool and somewhere else was Liverpool and Shanghai, and it's still there 7 years later because we never had the budget to change it. The plan was always to do Liverpool and New York straight after Shanghai, and that was probably 5 years ago. But, you know, needs must. If there's more money available, I'm sure that the thing will change at some stage. But let's not worry about the fact that we're not including everybody all the time. You move around, you develop an atmosphere, you develop a sense that you are good to do business with, that you will be open to new and fresh ideas, and in fact maybe challenge and dissonance at the same time. And I think museums, especially museums, are particularly interesting for lobby groups, because what we have, we hope we have, big diverse audiences that come along and can find out. If something like Anti-Slavery International, which is a London-based organisation, it's been around for 200 years, but it's about 3 people in an office in London and a website. That's it. That's Anti-Slavery International. But when they start working with National Museums Liverpool, they end up with audiences of millions strong. So it's in their interest to find a relationship with us, as it's in our interest to find a relationship with them, because they've got knowledge about slavery that we will never have. But then you'll develop a sense of trust with that organisation. Other organisations will come in their wake and want to work with you as well.
Of course, you have to decide, the museum has to decide whether the organisation is trustworthy in the first place.
Yes, you do, and again, that's no different from whatever. We can decide not to work with anybody because we don't trust anyone. We only trust ourselves. You know, that's the way to an early dusty death, really. So you're exercising judgment all the time. I'm not taking judgment out of this, and I'm not taking myself or yourself or anybody in charge of a cultural institution out of this. We have to rely on their judgment. That's why we train people. That's why we try to get good people working, imaginative people. You can't just take somebody in from the street and say, okay, run this cultural institution, and there's a load of really difficult decisions to make. You can spend years trying to develop an approach.
All right. The next one, you mentioned that directors inevitably influence their own views on the museums they lead. How then may we convince our own directors on the importance of accessibility? I think
Yes,
I think most people are convinced.
Yes,
no?
there's,
Should be.
in my experience, most younger people
Yes.
are convinced.
Right.
And it's very common that it's very frustrating to have a director that doesn't sign up to modernity. And people always are looking for modernity, and they get very frustrated at the fact that the director is calling the shots and doesn't really want anything to change. And all I can say is that you've got to keep working. It's happened to me as well. You know, I've not been a director all my life, but if the director is a problem, you've got to kind of separate from the director and get younger people with brighter ideas in. That's the way it works. But I have to hope that not all directors are awful, you know. But sometimes they're part of the issue in that they need persuading of modernisation as well. But you know, you've got to be able to present evidence to people to get them to change their ways. But it's certainly true that it's very, very common, and I can think of just about every nation I've ever been to where the risk is that you get an older generation of old men running cultural institutions, and they're completely stuck in their ways, and everybody else is very frustrated. It's very common. Join the club.
I hope the situation is not that bad here. Anyway, I'm just trying to choose between various minority questions. Oh, there was something about, okay. Oh, yes, there's something about hiring. Do you consciously hire staff from different ethnicities, backgrounds, etc.?
I consciously have always hired for attitude rather than skills and training. What I'm looking for, I tend to be colourblind. I'm blind to all sorts of things, but I'm always looking for people that are prepared to take risks and be imaginative. And those kind of people can come from any kind of background. So no, I don't take positive action in that sense. But the last thing I need ever coming along for an interview for a job is somebody that says, "Oh, I've got all these qualifications, and my brain died several years ago." I'm looking for people that are lively, that are more like the public than they are like people who should be working in a university department.
Okay, perhaps one last question. With your example, the Slavery Museum and the community's reaction to it, how can Singapore's museums touch on sensitive matters of inclusivity in the community, such as race?
Well, you know, it's not easy trying to run any form of museum. It's not easy. We mustn't assume it is. So if it's difficult, that's life. Again, get over yourself. If you don't like it and you're not up for the challenge, go work in another sector where you think life might be easier. I don't know, like banking or something like that. So it's always controversial. Successful museums are always controversial. And I think, I mean, I can't tell people in Singapore how to behave with regard to contentious issues. What we've done in Liverpool is take the bull by the horns, and sometimes we push the agenda. We do things that the people that provide the money are not even necessarily altogether sure about. But if you can demonstrate impact and popularity with the public, then miraculously you find that they'll line up behind you and say, "Oh, that was a good idea, and it was mine." And that's what you're looking for. But I think that the idea of different places trying to find different solutions, if you go to, I don't know, Australia or New Zealand or somewhere like that, you have a whole different set of issues, and it's not for me to explain to them what they should and shouldn't do. All I can really talk about is what happens in the UK, and we have exactly the same problems as you do in Singapore. But you need people that are, I don't know, stubborn, determined. Some people think it's brave. I'm not quite sure whether it equates with the word bravery, but certainly being determined to wreak modernization and change is something that lots of other things fall into place behind, and the issues are not insuperable.
And with that, I think our time is up. Thank you very much,
Okay,
David.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Fleming, and also our moderator, Dr. Kenson Kwok. Wonderful keynote address that we have had. Thank you very much to Dr. David Fleming, who's the chair in public history from Liverpool Hope University. Thank you. Well, so ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned by our guest of honor earlier, we will be having the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between the University of Melbourne and the National Heritage Board. Now, a little bit more about this. Now, this MOU will be the first that the National Heritage Board is signing with an overseas university. Now, this Memorandum of Understanding will enable both parties to collaborate on research, capability development, and specialist programs for our conservation staff and other professionals, amongst other areas. So we are certainly very excited to be able to sign this Memorandum of Understanding. Now, as we are getting the tables ready, I just want to inform all of you there will be a short tea reception after this. We'd like to, of course, invite all of you for a very nice tea reception, and after which, when we come back, we will have the first panel. It's on accessibility and diversity. Now, the topic, who are we addressing, and is it old wine in a new bottle? So we have 4 very established speakers, as well as our moderator as well, who will be conducting the session immediately after tea break. So as we're all set to go for the signing, I'm pleased to invite here to the front from the University of Melbourne. Can I invite Dr. Meredith Martin, Associate Director, Cultural and Public Engagement Chancellery, and Ms. Jennifer Chan, Assistant Chief Executive Officer, Corporate Development, who will be representing the National Heritage Board. Please. I'd also like to invite our guest of honor, Senior Minister of State, Ms. Siman, to witness this MOU signing. SMS, please. So I'd like to invite our signatories to please sign before we switch over the documents. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, this marks the Memorandum of Understanding between the University of Melbourne and the National Heritage Board. Thank you very much. Can we have a photo, please? Can we have a group photo together? So with that, I'd like to say a big thank you to our guest of honor, SMS, Ms. Siman, Dr. Meredith Martin, and Ms. Jennifer Chan. Let's give them a big round of applause. We look forward to great collaboration. Well, may we first, thank you very much. I would like to now invite our guest of honor, SMS, and our VIP entourage for a tea reception. Thank you very much for gracing our event today. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope all of you had an enjoyable tea break. Without further ado, we would like to start the first panel for this conference, Accessibility and Diversity. Who are we addressing, and is it old wine in a new bottle? So our panelists for this session, I'd first like to introduce to all of you, they are already seated down. Dr. Rimi Khan, Senior Research Fellow, University of Melbourne, Australia. Welcome. Mr. Tan Hao, Adjunct Senior Research Fellow, Arts, Culture and Media, Institute of Policy Studies. Welcome. Mr. Olivier Bolson, Director, Department of Visitor Experience, Musée du Quai, Branly, Jacques Chirac, France. Welcome. Mr. Kenny Ting, Group Director of Museums, National Heritage Board, and Director, Asian Civilisations Museum. Welcome. And the panel will be moderated by Mr. Paul Tan, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, National Arts Council. So before I hand the time over to Mr. Tan, just like to remind all our guests, during the panel session, please feel free to upload your questions onto Pigeonhole platform. But at the same time as well, if you'd like to ask questions via the microphone, you can do so. We do have we will pass the microphones to you later on should you wish to ask the questions via the microphone. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to hand the time over to our moderator, Mr. Paul Tan.
Thank you, Lester. Hi and a very good morning, everyone. I'm hoping that our next session can be a little bit more informal. Although we have access to the Pigeonhole, I'm hoping that if you do have questions that, given that we're now a little bit more intimate in size, some people have left, and I thank you for staying, that you will have the gumption to put up your hands and share your views. Pigeonhole is still available, but I would much prefer a dialogue and to break the fourth wall. You know, if you leave it at pigeonhole, everyone will be looking at their screens and, you know, we're going to have this gap. I want to narrow the gap and build bridges to community, which I think is what culture tries to do. Today's discussion, we have 4 very esteemed speakers and we have 1.5 hours. I think it's a topic that's very close to many of our hearts. It's intriguingly named. I'm not sure why old wine in new bottle, but certainly accessibility and diversity are 2 very key ideas in cultural institutions and certainly in the arts groups here and I think all around the world. What does accessibility mean? What does diversity mean? Maybe I just offer a few thoughts. I mean, in Singapore, we see ourselves as a very multicultural, we're certainly multi-religious. We are one of the most religiously diverse countries in the world. We see diversity in terms of the different demographics within society, whether it's intergenerational, but also people who have special needs, which we touched on this morning, people who live in the public housing suburbs who may not have access to the the cultural offerings which are typically in the city center, perhaps versus a more affluent, educated demographic, where diversity and also means new citizens versus people who have lived here and been born here, as well as I think diversity also includes people who live and work in Singapore and reside in Singapore but who may not be citizens here. Certainly, these are some of the things I think in cultural institutions that we think about. But we also have 2 speakers from France and from Australia to prevent us from being a frog looking in the well. We should look at what's happening, in the rest of the world as well. And this morning we spent some time talking about museums. So we do have a very esteemed museum speaker, Kenny, who will talk about the Asian Civilization Museum. And also the lens on the arts community. So we have Tan Hao from Singapore. So I think it'll be an interesting session for the next 1.5 hours. Every speaker will have 10 minutes, and I think some of them have presentations, so that would be good. And then after that, I would take 1 or 2 questions. I would ask, I've prepared just in case. But mostly the session is for you, so I hope that we can have a lively discussion and that you will put up your hand and take the mic and ask a question and make a stand, But if you are shy and retiring, Pigeonhole is always available. Okay, so on that note, if that's all right, we will kick off our session with Rimi. And I'll just quickly say a few words about Rimi before she starts. She's a senior research fellow with the Melbourne Social Equity and School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. Her current interests include arts and multiculturalism, cultural policy, and ethical fashion. She has published a book, Art and Community, The Provisional Citizen, as well as numerous articles in journals, including the International Journal of Cultural Policy, and she currently teaches subjects on cultural policy and cultural complexity. So if you can, give her a warm Singapore welcome to Dr. Rimi Tan.
Thanks, Paul, for that introduction, and thanks to the organisers of this conference for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. As the title of this panel acknowledges, the question of access is not a new one, and it's certainly one that I keep returning to in my own research on cultural institutions in Australia. And I think it's important that we keep interrogating this idea of access. So what do we mean when we talk about access in cultural institutions? It's largely been a response to the shifting makeup of populations, and it reflects the different cultural interests and priorities of different groups. In the Australian context, it's an idea that's informed arts funding programs since at least the 1970s, and access has been a response to the challenge that is posed to cultural institutions by migrants, by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, by rural communities, by people with different physical abilities and different economic capacities. And the term access reflects an understanding of the new and diverse publics that arts and cultural institutions have to address. And access is also linked to certain ideals, so ideals of common space, of belonging, of ownership. And I think in these cases, it's implicit that there is a shared or common culture. So there's a tension in this idea of access between a recognition of difference on the one hand, and this drive towards a shared or common culture. In Australia, debates about access and inclusion have had to grapple with what's been called the civilising imperative. So historically, the shared culture that's been imagined has been culture with a capital C. And this has led to what gets described as the Shakespeare in the Park model of cultural access. And this model is still quite a popular one, but it's one that leaves little scope for new cultural influences, innovation or transformation. And the access that's imagined in this model is usually a linear, one-way form of access to a body of cultural work that's largely unchanged. So we might be in the park, but we're still watching Shakespeare. My own research has looked at how multicultural arts and migrant artists are presented by cultural institutions. I've looked at the work of the Arts Centre in Melbourne, which is one of Australia's flagship arts and cultural venues in the centre of Melbourne's arts and cultural precinct. So the Arts Centre has, over the last decade or so, taken on different models for engaging with culturally diverse communities. Most recently, the Asia TOPA program, which was the Asia Pacific Triennial of Performing Arts. It was a huge contemporary arts festival that ran over a number of weeks. It involved almost 1,000 artists from across the Asia Pacific and attracted, I think it's 900,000 audience members, so an incredible kind of size of audience, but also quite a diverse audience for the Arts Centre. And it used this kind of high arts sort of program to attract a more diverse audience. And we can contrast this to other programs at the Arts Centre where they've engaged with Multicultural Arts Victoria, which is Victoria's peak body for the multicultural arts. The Mix It Up program was part of this partnership, and this involved inviting international world music headliners to perform at the Arts Centre, and alongside these headliners, there were local artists from migrant communities who were supporting these international artists. And in a lot of cases, these local artists were performing in the lobby of the Arts Centre or putting on shows in the outdoor courtyard spaces. So it really raised questions about where do we literally position cultural difference within these cultural spaces? Is it in the lobby or is it on the main stage? How do we engage with local community groups, or do we make connections with arts innovators overseas? And how does inviting these different groups into this space change the cultural hierarchies that have historically structured these spaces? So the term access is a seemingly simple one, but it obscures some of these more complex questions. A useful way to think about these questions is through the framework of cultural citizenship. When I talk about cultural citizenship, I'm not concerned with citizenship as a legal and political framework, but I'm referring to the informal and cultural dimensions of citizenship. And when we talk about belonging to a nation state, we know that this is a cultural question as much as it is a legal and political one. So cultural citizenship involves a circular framework of culture. In my own research, it's an idea that I've mobilised to talk not just about access, but about participation and the capacities and forms of belonging that are required for participation. At the same time, we also know that participation produces capacities and belonging. So participation can result in greater belonging or produce forms of cultural knowledge, cultural literacy and cultural capital that can then enable one to participate more fully across different forms of public cultural life. So it's a circular model of cultural access rather than the linear one that we might be more familiar with. And importantly, cultural citizenship involves the capacity to change the dominant culture. So it acknowledges that there is a dominant culture, however you might want to define that. So in the Australian context, we might describe that as white Australia, as Anglo-Australian culture, or mainstream Australia. But there's a kind of aesthetic language that goes along with these cultural formations. And cultural citizenship is about the capacity to speak that language and to participate in these dominant cultural spaces, but also to shape and redefine that language and those spaces. So cultural citizenship allows us to understand this cycle and the connections between different forms and spaces of cultural participation. So I want to give an example of what these connections might look like through the work of Khaled Sabsabi, who's a visual and sound artist in Australia. And in the course of his career, he's moved between official and unofficial spaces of culture, and he's become an advocate for new models of access and transformation in cultural institutions. So Sabsabi's family migrated to Australia from Lebanon in the late 70s. And in the 80s and 90s, Sabsabi became one of the pioneers of Australian hip-hop. He gradually became involved in community and activist arts, and he's worked across a whole range of different social and institutional contexts. So he's delivered arts and music programs in prisons, in schools, in refugee camps, in youth centres. So he's worked closely with community arts organisations and migrant communities in the western suburbs of Sydney. In 2003, he shifted from sound into visual media, and much of his work articulates the aesthetics and politics of migration and cultural exchange from these highly localised contexts. So his best-known work is the Naqshbandi Greenacre engagement, which is a video installation depicting the everyday religious practice of a Sufi Muslim community in Sydney. And this work won the Blake Prize for Religious Art in 2011, which is quite a prestigious art prize in Australia. And it's since been acquired by the Museum for Contemporary Art in Sydney. His works are regularly exhibited there, as well as other state galleries in Australia. He's participated in numerous international biennales. So he's an advocate for migrant communities, but his work also circulates successfully within these national and transnational spaces of elite art. So it's this mobility as an artist that can open up access points for others and transform the mainstream. So I think part of the response for cultural institutions is to understand the relationship between these different spaces of cultural production and belonging, which is a problem for many large cultural institutions because they're often tasked with representing national culture or official culture. And to meaningfully address the question of access, I think these official institutions need to pay more attention to what's happening in these other spaces. So these local spaces, popular spaces, community and commercial spaces, as well as now digital spaces, because this is where cultural participation and production is taking place. So access has to involve community building and cultural exchange through these dispersed networks of cultural production and participation, and being open to cultural change and transformation. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rimi. And I think that sets us off in a very good, for a very good discussion, giving us a frame and some ideas on cultural citizenship, and to suggest perhaps the role of cultural institutions and their need to constantly think about the larger landscape in which culture is lived, right? Yeah, I think that's a good frame to start us off today's discussion. But we're going to move back to Singapore and invite Mr. Tan Hao to speak next. Tan Hao is someone I've known for many years, and whom I've actually last moderated at the Singapore Writers' Festival. So whatever his bio may say, his bio is not complete because Tan Hao actually wears many, many hats. And his bio doesn't quite say that he's also a very accomplished writer and has actually published young adult fiction on top of his very well-known plays, which are well loved and even studied in schools. But today he's wearing his other hat, which is as an adjunct senior research fellow in Arts, Culture, and Media Research Cluster at the Singapore Institute of Policy Studies. His research areas include arts and cultural policy and media and internet policy, as well as education, arts education, and the role of education in culture and human development. I think this morning he will talk about how arts needs to go beyond the usual mode of merely bringing arts to the community, and perhaps I think he's going to suggest a more meaningful conceptualization of accessibility. So sounds intriguing. On that note, please join me to welcome Tan Hao.
Thank you, Paul. Nowadays, when you have speakers up here and you're on the phone, it doesn't mean that you are talking to your wife or your friends. I was just taking notes, so it's a very interesting discussion. I'll go from the Rimi's theoretical approach to something more of what an older person likes to do is tell the government what to do, right? Let me get it up. I'd like to thank the Culture Academy for inviting me. I hope you don't regret it from what I say. Today, I'd like to argue for a rethinking of the meaning of two words, access and community. Specifically, access to the arts needs to go beyond the usual mode of merely bringing the arts to communities or vice versa, towards a wider, more meaningful conceptualization of accessibility. And also the need to think, to rethink the meaning of disadvantaged communities, as well as what forms communities in Singapore, especially in a context of Singapore where we are supposed to be open, cosmopolitan, and tolerant. So let me go to the first word, community Singapore. What is the meaning of community in Singapore? In June 2018, according to the latest statistics, there are 3.47 million citizens, 520,000 permanent residents, and a non-resident population of 1.64 million. The permanent residents are the more educated, better off, the professionals, managers, executives with salaries. The non-residents are less educated, though not always so. Some come here because they couldn't find a better job, or their degrees may not give them a better paying job in their home countries. Many have college degrees, but they are definitely earners of lower wages. They include 280,000 men who are construction workers from Bangladesh and China and other countries, and domestic workers, 250,000 women from the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, and a few other countries. Sometimes they're called transient workers. Singapore has no refugees. The domestic workers are a particularly interesting category of non-resident residents in Singapore. Some of them actually have been here for 20 years or more. They are as permanent as many of the permanent residents. If they get pregnant or come down with HIV and their yearly tests, they are deported. They could be summarily dispatched home by their employers at the employer's whims. In the sense of this precariousness of theirs, they are transient. They are here, they are not here. They are, some of them, permanent transients, if possible. In Singapore, the idea of community, and the idea of community as applied to arts policy, cultural policy, is limited to Singaporeans and at most to permanent residents. Not everyone here who lives here, no matter for how many years, is considered part of our community. It's so officially, politically, socially, and it's so artistically and culturally. It is not that artistically and culturally they are absent. After all, the National Gallery, not very far from here, is primarily a home for Southeast Asian modern painting. And just a little further on, the Singapore Art Museum collects Southeast Asian contemporary artists and hosts to numerous Southeast Asian contemporary art exhibitions. And the Southeast Asian Film Festival and the ongoing Singapore International Arts Festival feature many films from the Philippines, Myanmar, Indonesia, and the region from which we draw our permanent transients. What is absent is the notion that these works and events should be sold or tendered to them, to the non-Singaporeans among us who are resident here. For instance, the Filipino staff who man our counters and serve our restaurants, and the domestic workers who keep our houses clean, wash and iron our clothes, cook our meals, look after our children, parents, ourselves. I'm just thinking how nice it would be if we do have a carnival one day, a Philippine carnival along Orchard Road. On Sunday, of course, because that's when they get their day off. Or have concerts by Regine Velasquez or Sarah Geronimo. They've sung here before, but you have to pay too much money for a domestic worker to afford. So when you look at the plans that the government has put out for the arts, the Renaissance City Plan in the 2000s, the Arts and Culture Strategic Review of 2013, and of course, the new, our SG Arts Plan just launched by NAC. The idea of community expressed there is limited to a diminished sort of a way of looking at community which I feel is too narrow. And that our arts and culture programs by the government should be more embracing than that. Of course, we do very well, we try at least, and we say it, for diversity, for access, for young children, elderly, for the persons with disabilities, and money has been put into it. But I think that some money, at least, has to be put in other areas. When I tried to look for Tagalog book I was learning Tagalog for a while, given that up, you can't find in the National Library, or you can't find a Bengali book, or a Myanmar book in our national libraries. Do they have a right? Are we under certain obligations? Or should we do it just for grace? What the government is not doing, thankfully, the NGOs, and sometimes the foreign workers themselves do. There's the Migrant Worker Poetry Competition of 2013. Ethos Books put out a collection by a Bangladeshi construction worker who was a journalist before he came here. Now there's a migrant library just opened a few months ago at Farrer Park, and they have Tagalog books, Bengali books, Thai books, 600 of them. So that's the point I want to say about our needing to extend our idea of community. I think, to stretch the definition of community a bit, the other problem is that the community is not extended to what is considered not quite normal. And I refer, of course, it's an old topic of mine, to the 377A, the Penal Code, which still criminalizes consensual adult male sex. And of course, the other kinds of discriminations and prejudices that the LGBTI people suffer in Singapore. If you have watched Bohemian Rhapsody, right, the portrayal of Freddie Mercury is allowed because in the end, he got his comeuppance. Portrayal of happy homosexual couples, not allowed, because it's supposedly promotion of the gay lifestyle. Our libraries have taken out books which tries to explain to young people the idea that homosexual families are possible. We nearly burned them, pulped them, but fortunately we didn't. For children who are young, in particular, who are searching for some kind of way to understand their sexuality, which may not be heterosexual, these kinds of materials can be a lifesaver, can take away so much anguish.
Sorry, time.
Yep.
Yeah.
But we don't allow them access to these materials, not in our libraries, not in our schools. It's a kind of cruelty via censorship. I have a few more points, but I'll end there. If you ask questions, I'll probably talk a bit about that. Other kinds of access. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Hao. Yeah. Tan Hao has argued very passionately for a broadened definition of community, which I'm sure many of us in the room would be very sympathetic to. I would add, as someone who works in programming, well, I used to work in the Writers' Festival, that I think there is an attempt to try and reach out, certainly to the migrant community, and that there are arts groups, Singaporean arts groups like Singlit Station, some of you may be aware, that have even on their own, with some support from us, put out events as well as publications that showcase and celebrate creative works of the migrant community. And I think there are other things happening as well. And I'm sure as in the course of today's conversation, some of this could also surface. And of course, the second provocation, which is something that has energized many of us in the cultural community, and to our friends from overseas, this is something that has been in the limelight, in the last couple of years, which of course is the role of, which is about, of course, the 377A, and that has been discussed. And I'm sure there are other thoughts on this, so I hope that we can hear more views about this. Tan Hao has argued very clearly for where he stands, and that is part of the diversity conversation. Right. On that note, and I'll save some of that because I think more of these thoughts will come out, I'm going to invite our third speaker, and of course he's Olivier Boisson. I hope I get the pronunciation right. Sorry, I do not speak French, and so I hope I don't mangle anything. He is the director of the Department of Visitor Experience at the Musée du Quai Branly. Roll eyeball. Hope I get it right. Yeah. He, like many of our other speakers here, wear a number of hats. He has come from the diplomatic world. He has served as the Counselor for Cooperation and Cultural Affairs with the Embassy of France to Senegal. He has also been wearing that diplomatic hat, been based in Ottawa as well, in Canada, as well as in New York City. And he has also taught in 2 Parisian universities and has worked, like Tan Hao, as a journalist as well. So many people wearing different hats, which I think all add to a very interesting life journey. Today he's going to speak about accessibility and diversity at the museum, which of course is in Paris, and talk about how what does that notion of accessibility mean for a national museum in the context of France's cultural policy. So on that note, can I please welcome Mr. Olivier.
Thank you very much, and thanks again to Culture Academy for putting together this annual conference. It's always a lot of work, I'm sure, but it's always a very interesting experience, at least it is for yours truly. I would like to start off with a few facts and a few figures. Facts. Musée du quai Branly, named after its location in Paris, the banks of the Seine River. Branly, by the way, was an engineer. He worked a lot on the telecoms at the time, the telegraph. But Quai Branly is a museum that focuses on arts and civilizations of Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania. It walks the fine line between being an anthropology ethnography and a fine arts museum, always walking the line and keeping the balance between the two. It is a national museum, and as such, it follows the official texts of the Ministry of Culture and also the Ministry of Higher Education and Research. And it gets subsidies from those two ministries on top of its own resources, obviously from ticket sales and other resources. It's very different from other major Parisian museums because, as was mentioned earlier, many locations in Paris attract many foreign tourists because they are quintessentially Parisian, French, European, Western. For instance, Musée d'Orsay for French Impressionists, or Versailles for the period of French monarchy, 80% tourists in both cases, or even the Louvre, although it's a much broader swath. Quai Branly, on the other hand, has 80% French nationals in its audience, and I'll come back to that later. The museum was promoted by former French President of France, Jacques Chirac. It opened in mid-2006, so it's 12 years old now. It's a Jean Nouvel architecture, an architect who also designed the Cartier Foundation for Contemporary Art building in Paris, and the Institute of the Arab World Cultural Center, as well as many buildings throughout the world, including Louvre Abu Dhabi, by the way. And Branly is what we call a cultural city. It is a museum, but it's also a theater auditorium. It is a cinema, it has a garden, it has restaurants as well, and a research center, so it is really a cultural city. A few facts and a few figures. The museum has 10,000 square feet of exhibition space. It presents around 10 temporary exhibits every year, including some very controversial ones. For instance, 2 years ago, the Color Line on African-American art in the days of slavery. More recently on Madagascar, the first exhibit on Madagascar since 1946 in France, and Madagascar was a French colony. Or currently, we have an exhibit on paintings from the colonial era, late 19th, early 20th century. And as you know, by the way, France is a country of critical thinking in its education system and in its population at large. So the French tend to be a fairly vocal lot, and they tend to question a lot of things and to be fairly critical in the good sense of the term, but they can be a tough audience. So Branly is deliberately positioned to create questioning, controversy, and to present things that can be hard subjects, although it presents things that are not Parisian, French, European, and Western. There are 3,500 pieces on display in the main collection, 300,000 pieces in storage, and the cultural city has a staff of 250 museum staff and 250 contractors staff on site as well. Visitorship in 2016 stands at 1.2 million, 80% are French nationals. Remember that France is nearing towards a population of 70 million. The Paris region only is 12 million, so it's a major urban area with a lot of diversity and many people from dozens of different diasporas from around the world linked to France's past or to other more recent international events. In 2017, for instance, the museum welcomed 3,000 school groups, 650 disadvantaged, underserved audience groups, 300 disabled, impaired groups. The Department of Visitors Experience, which I'm heading, it's called in French, Direction des Publics, has several goals. First, to study and analyze audience behavior and preferences, which is very important, as David Fleming mentioned this morning. It's obvious you need to know what your audiences are in the different profiles before you can put together a strategy. Our goal is also to provide the best possible experience to every visitor, to design special events, visitor tools, cultural activities in order to make permanent collections and temporary exhibits more attractive and more accessible, and globally to boost visitorship and visitors' loyalty as well. Now, the way we understand accessibility in diversity at Quai Branly is twofold. First, we understand it as being integrated from the planning stage, from the days the building was conceived by the architect, and refined since, because in the first 2 years, there was a lot of talk with the various non-for-profit groups representing different groups of visitors with special needs, and there were lots of adjustments in the first 2 years. But really, the two ways we understand accessibilities are thus. Accessibilité universelle, what we call universal accessibility, which is having offerings that are as inclusive as possible, and by setting the bar as high as possible, we make sure we can include as many people as possible, whatever their needs and profiles might be. And then audience targeting, which is specific offerings, because not everyone with a specific interest or specific need wants to be included in a group of people with other interests or other needs. So you need to do both at the same time, both accessibilité universelle and targeting and specific offerings. So a word on accessibilité universelle. It's really the idea that whenever possible, all visitors may share the experience of a common space for a common time using common tools. That means access to the building itself, access to cultural offerings, and access to information. Now, how do we work around that? Organizing accessibility. Inside the Department of Visitors Experience, we have several people whose job focuses on specific types of audiences, for instance, disabled or impaired, families, young adult audiences, underserved, disadvantaged groups, and so on. And that's really important because the minute you have a contact person, a resource, who knows exactly how an audience segment functions and what they prefer, you have a lot of traction with the rest of the museum to present proposals for projects and programs. Typically, for physical accessibility, we have pre-production meetings for temporary exhibits to make sure that accessibility requirements are met. It can be a tough challenge when you speak with curators or with the Department of Heritage, but usually we get our way. And there is a constant work group, accessibility to all audiences within the museum. There is also, again for physical accessibility, a yearly mixed accessibility committee where all non-for-profits that represent specific impairments are around the table, and we have year-long partners in various fields. Now, accessibilité universelle in terms of building. The Garden and the Jean Nouvel building have guiding strips, elevators, a ramp to the collection, 4%, which is wheelchair compatible, a main street through the collections, which is fitted with sensorial devices and with audiovisual. In terms of cultural offerings, the guided tours, the narrated tours, the workshops and activities in the museum's reading lounge are designed with maximum possible accessibility to accommodate all possible needs. So the idea is really, whether children or adults or the elderly, to have offerings that are as inclusive as possible. On the other hand, we have also specific cultural offerings. Alpha visits for beginners level French, notably migrant populations. You see on the left corner to the bottom the type of cards we use. They focus on materials, parts of the body, on a sculpture to help with vocabulary. And you have also tactile visits to the bottom right corner, descriptive visits, and easy to read and understand French, ERUF visits, for people who are beginning or who have low language skills. Now, other tools, audio guides, obviously, in 9 languages, including Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, and Russian for the 25-point track. There's also an 80-point track. Les Experts Quai Branly, which is a dedicated app focusing on an ethnologist that will present various regions of the world. Sign language videos, subtitled videos, easy to read and understand French plates in the main exhibition space. My little exploration bag is a bag that contains objects that call to all of your senses: touch, smell, sight. They can be used by children, by adults, by people with disabilities. We have one themed on Morocco, and we're putting one theme together on Greenland as well. We have tactile wall sections at the collections level, and audio, text, braille, image visitor stations that you see at the bottom right corner. Everyone tends to use those stations, and not just the visually impaired. The museum's website, it's 85% compatible to France's highest standard for accessibility after a 2-year revamp. We have dedicated sections as well, for instance here for the disabled, and press packages. We have specific brochures and newsletter. I think the only museum that has a 50-page brochure especially for physical accessibility, with everything you can do at the museum by type of disability, and also a dedicated newsletter which you see on the bottom right corner that goes out several times a year. For the underserved audiences, we have the same pattern with a dedicated full brochure and newsletter as well that goes out to our contacts. I could elaborate on that in the Q&A session. And finally, we have inclusive special projects. Actually, this week in Paris at Quai Branly, it goes on once every 2 years only. We have the All Access Week, a 9-day program full of very inclusive activities and special projects for special needs visitors and valid visitors alike. And for the underserved community, we have a new 3-day program in the spring of 2019, mixed with all other audiences, which will be called Solidarity Days. Finally, out of the museum, we have the Atelier Nomade program in the Parisian suburbs. It's a 2-year co-constructed series of activities, and we have specific partnerships with Paris region hospitals and prisons as well. Finally, we team up with other museums as part of a task force, along with the Ministry of Culture, to put together books as on the left corner, the reference book for accessibility in exhibits, practical guides, and documentaries. One thing I should mention to finish off is that really the museum is an expression of a larger ecosystem. And by ecosystem, I mean the fact that a lot of what we do is the expression of France's public policies in terms of its education system, in terms of its social safety net system, in terms of its laws and directives, for instance, the 2005 Disability Act. Everything the museum does as a national museum is informed literally by those public policies. So we are not doing this all by ourselves and disconnected from a larger framework. This is really integrated in a much larger context. And I think this is something to bear in mind. I mentioned it earlier this year during the Malraux seminar on another subject, but this is really something to bear in mind because you cannot really isolate what an institution does from its larger context, and you have to make it a two-way system. It takes two to tango. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Yeah. And merci beaucoup to Olivier for giving us a very comprehensive scan of what Quai Branly does in trying to create a very inclusive environment at the museum. I think my quick takeaway is that the use of data and technology certainly helps you to create that inclusive environment. It's so useful that you're able to tap on the data to understand the diverse demographics that are your potential communities. From one institution to another, I would like to invite our fourth and final speaker for this morning, and he's a familiar face to those of us in Singapore's cultural scene. He's Kenny Ting, of course. He's the director of the Asian Civilization Museum and the Peranakan Museum, and concurrently the group director overseeing the museums and festivals at the National Heritage Board. As the director of ACM, as it's fondly known, you know, in Singapore we love our acronyms, he has overseen the shift in the museum's curatorial approach from a geographical to a more thematic cross-cultural focus. And some recent exhibitions include the arts of Myanmar, Angkor, and Korea, and on Buddhist and Hindu art across Asia. He's presently the chairperson of the Asia-Europe Museum Network, which aims to promote mutual understanding between the peoples of Asia and Europe. And like many other multi-hatters we have on today's session, he's also an author. His most recent book is Singapore to 1819, A Living Legacy, that just got published last month, and that is his third book. And his previous publications deal with travel and the heritage of Asian port cities. So on that very august note, let us welcome Kenny Ting.
Thank you so very much, Paul, and thank you so much to the Cultural Academy for having me here. It's such a privilege and a treat to be with these other distinguished speakers. I thought I would share a little bit of what Asian Civilisations Museum is doing in the space of accessibility and inclusivity. And it's also very timely because we just launched our 3 final permanent galleries on the 2nd floor, which saw, what Paul said, our transformation from a sort of geographical to a thematic Asian art museum. Just very, so I just have 2 points to make today. The first point is a point about our mission. We are Singapore's National Museum of Asian Art, so very strangely, like the quai Branly, we are the National Museum that's not about Singapore. It's actually about Asia, and in some ways, Singapore's link with Asia and the rest of the world. And in our recent transformation, we've shifted away from presenting the civilizations in Asia in their own sort of geographical regions and silos to looking at the connections and interactions between civilizations in Asia. So our focus is not so much, or our manifesto is not about sort of boundaries and borders, but about networks and connections and flows within Asia and between Asia and the rest of the world. We do this in 3 ways, by exploring 3 very important themes, the first being trade, specifically maritime trade. With this theme, we present a very strong collection of Asian export art. The second theme we explore is faith, and the third is design. Trade and faith, of course, are very important because they are drawn from what Singapore is at its very essence. It's a multi-faith, multicultural port, city, and trading hub. But trade and faith are also very important driving forces in history. They fuel the movement of people, cultures, ideas, innovation across the globe and certainly across Asia. So this idea of sort of building bridges, Paul mentioned this earlier, looking at how civilizations have interacted and have never existed in silos, exist through everything that we do in the special exhibitions that we curate, in the programs and so on. And it also then translates into our mission today, which is to build bridges across nations, across cultures, across faiths, and also to build bridges between the ancient and the contemporary. We are ultimately a museum of Asian antiquities. And I was very moved also by Dr. David Fleming's point about how every single museum everywhere has its very specific place and role within the place and context it is in. So our role is, in a similar way in Singapore, is also quite unique. We're in the space of education in terms of educating our Singaporean public and visitors about Southeast Asia and Asia, something that's very critical since the center of gravity of the world is shifting somewhat here, eastward. The second role we play very strongly is diplomacy. So actually, we're very close with the diplomatic and ambassadorial corps, and we work very closely also in some ways to sort of engage the broader sort of Southeast Asian and Asian community here in Singapore. And the third very important role that we play now that our faith and belief galleries are done on the 2nd floor is that we very much believe in Singapore's core value of religious harmony and interfaith dialogue. And we work closely with the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth to open up our spaces for dialogue related to faith, particularly for young Singaporeans. Okay, so the second point that I want to make is that I am definitely not one of those directors that is not against accessibility. In fact, I'm actually rather typically Singaporean in that I'm quite clinical, slightly overachieving, you know, in terms of ticking boxes as to how we actually reach out to all the various different communities that we need to reach out to. It's important to define who these communities are. And this is sort of the map that we have at the museum, the various different kinds of communities at all levels that we have to reach out to. Now, special exhibitions are very core to a museum's work, and again, you know, in typical sort of slightly more clinical, efficient fashion, we thought that the best way to sort of, you know, incorporate access in the museum is to use special exhibitions as a kind of package. So beyond the core special exhibition, to ensure that there are surrounding activities that reach out to this sort of matrix or this network of communities that you have to reach out to. So I'm just going to use as an example our Korea exhibition that took place last year. Was very, very successful. And believe me when I say that I demand that every single special exhibition has these components. And it's probably not new. Most museums probably do this as well. Of course, our cross-cultural mission goes through the exhibition. So in this case, for example, we explore the interactions between Korea, Japan, and China historically, particularly in the space of diplomacy and the space of art. In the same way, we explore how different faiths have interacted. In this case, it was Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism within the context of Chosun-era Korea. Everything on the wall has to be translated into the 4 national languages of Singapore, so that's English, Chinese, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. We also have tours in all the various languages that are required, given the sort of mix of our visitors. The diplomatic corps and our patrons, of course, are very important to us. Our openings are always diplomatic. The ambassadors would show up en masse. That's the way we engage with the diplomatic corps here. Of course, we have previews and such for our patrons, including a very, very important government funders, our political leaders. The academic community is very important for us. Every exhibition needs to provide a very different and unique view onto the particular subject and to contribute new knowledge to this subject. So every exhibition comes with an international symposium where we engage and bring in speakers from Singapore as well as abroad. Every exhibition comes with an academic catalogue where we do the same thing. We invite the experts in the field in Singapore and abroad to contribute essays, and we partner very strongly with the volunteers and the docents as well as other academics and universities to provide a range of public academic-focused talks at the museum in the course of the exhibition. Every exhibition ends off with an interpretive space, a slightly more innovative and engaging way to engage families with their children onto the subject matter. And these are generally very, very popular. Every exhibition, I'm sounding like a broken record. Every single exhibition comes with a massive weekend festival. So in this case, it was a Seoul Awesome Weekend Festival. It drew about 15,000 guests. We had a Cambodian weekend festival with the Angkor exhibition, a Filipino weekend festival with an exhibition we did on Christianity in Asia the year before. And these are really to attract the grassroots and the community. They're very, very popular, as I mentioned, usually lines out the door. This is quite important. I constantly ask myself, how do we make antiquity sexy to sort of the younger millennial generation? Part of it, of course, is to incorporate a slightly more contemporary interpretations of antiquities, which is what we've done now. So every special exhibition comes with a major, large-scale contemporary art installation where we feature an artist of the Asian community. And I demand also that everything is curated with an eye to how people consume in the digital media space, which is that it has to be visual, it has to be sort of spontaneous. So we're talking about epic sightlines and sweeping panoramas and the opportunity to get very close up to the design, details of design in the artworks. We have no money really for marketing, and so we depend very much on digital media to promote our exhibitions. And in this case, I'm very proud to say that our Spotify campaign for the Chosun Korea show actually won us the very prestigious Grand Prix in the Singapore Media Awards last year, as well as 2 other awards. So it's 3 awards altogether: the best in audio and the best use of budget, because our budget was, well, 0. Finally, the lifestyle precinct sort of stakeholder group, by which I mean sort of young parents, young professionals, is also very important to us. So every special exhibition also comes with an installment of the Asian Culture and Music series, where we place traditional Asian performing arts on our riverfront terrace. We have a magnificent riverfront location with the backdrop being Singapore's contemporary skyline. And every quarter, we then present one of the sort of highlights of Asian traditional performing arts here. And the point that we're trying to make is, again, to bridge the ancient and the contemporary, to show that there is a place for Asian traditional arts in the contemporary city. These are immensely popular, again, and they actually reach out to a much younger population than we expect. I think that access and special needs is important. I don't want to sort of reveal too much because, as Minister Simman mentioned, we have been doing an accessibility audit, and the outcomes of that will actually be released earlier next year. But we have been doing pilots with various groups, and we will have a much more systematic way of actually welcoming serving the various kind of special needs groups in our museum. But the final point I want to make actually is that through a range of these various ways of reaching out to audiences, we've managed to actually bring down the median age of the museum quite drastically. I've been back in Singapore for about 5 years, and when I was first back, our median age was about 45, and this year it was 33. And all of it is really due to us trying to understand better what the various community groups in Singapore need for them to have a very enjoyable and also very enriching time in the city. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Kenny, and congratulations on all the good work that the ACM has done. I think speaking very quickly helps you get to your destination faster. I hope you agree we've had 4 very interesting presentations. I do have some questions here, but I'm not going to go to the pigeonhole just yet. I will offer it to the floor if anybody wants to ask a question. Actually, more importantly, the one thing I don't quite like about Pigeonhole is it doesn't allow you to make a comment. You may not have a question, but if you want to kind of elaborate on the point that you have, whether you agree or disagree, or you want to supplement with a point, I think it's always better to hear from the person themselves. So I'm going to open it to the floor, and I think there are microphones roaming around. Yes, is that? Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Aaron Ciso. Yeah. It's a question for Olivier. It's really... I'll preface it by saying that the Cape Branly collection has so much indigenous material. So how does this concept of universal access intersect with the needs of objects? So if certain objects within the collection cannot be opened up to universal access, how does the museum actually deal with this? So if there are objects that require secrecy or that have particular sensitivities that cannot easily coexist with this desire for universal access, how does the museum deal with it?
Yes. That's for Olivier.
Thank you for the question. If I understand correctly, there are in fact certain objects on the main collections level that we could provide tomography for. That is, we could provide technically the means to see inside the object and offer it as a visitor experience. But we don't do it because some of these objects contain relics that are sacred, although the objects have been deactivated of their magical charge by the persons of the respective cultures before they were presented in the collections. Though we have the technology to see inside the object and to present the visitors with that possibility, we don't do it because the contents are not to be seen. That's one example. Another example is that, for instance, visitors, whether they have vision or whether they are visually impaired, who want a tactile experience of a piece of art, we have facsimiles sculpted out of wood, a collection of about 30 of them that are offered in activities, for instance, in the reading lounge, the adventure of a piece of art in the dark, whereby visitors, whether they have vision or if they are vision impaired, can have a full tactile experience of a series of works of art using the facsimiles made of wood. If that answers the question.
Okay. Thank you, Olivier. I will have a question of my own, which is also partly inspired by some of the comments here. And it's a broad question, and this can go to anyone. In the context of cultural institutions, or even in the larger arts landscape, right? How do you celebrate diversity, showcase diversity, but at the same time maintain unity? Well, unity was the word that was used here, but I would say maintain some shared experience so that people feel that they are part of the larger community, part of something larger beyond themselves. And of course, I reflect on Rimi's comments about perhaps how the dominant Australian culture deals with, interrogates, or engages with, let's say, the First Nation cultures. So to hear some thoughts, or from Tan Hao, is there a point where that diversity and that showcase and that demand for that diversity to be heard actually leads to perhaps other challenges, perhaps polarizing in the communities. Yeah. So some broad thoughts about the tensions between diversity and the kind of larger good that everybody surely wants, and which is to celebrate common space and to have some kind of togetherness as a people, however you define that, as whether it's a national political boundary or something else. Yeah. Any thoughts? Yeah.
I guess I might start by responding to that. Yeah, I think certainly in the Australian context, we have a history of multicultural policy that goes back almost sort of 40 years now. And that multicultural policy space is itself informed by that tension. So the kind of this imperative to celebrate diversity and difference at the same time as it tries to construct this unified national identity. And that is then translated into the art space through the programs of the Australia Council, for example, which is Australia's national arts funding body, which has itself grappled with this tension over the decades. And I think there's a problem with worrying too much about constructing that unified identity and always having to kind of deliver this, kind of singular narrative of identity. And I think what a number of arts and cultural institutions in Australia have been able to do successfully and productively over the years is to think of this more in terms of a dialogue or an exchange of culture rather than this kind of, reductive celebration of diversity. And thinking in terms of the ways that different people, different communities can be invited into cultural spaces, not just as spectators of diversity, but to construct their own narratives and, to be involved in programming. So, and then the space itself becomes more dynamic without having to kind of impose, this singular.
And there's also more ownership as well,
That's
presumably, right?
Yeah.
Tan Hao, any thoughts?
Thank you. Singaporeans like our diversity without disagreement. This is not possible. And I think the unity that we have is a fake unity. It's like a couple living together and they disagree, they never quarrel, right? But it is a fake unity. I think that debate is good.
So that's like the dialogue that
disagreement is good, right? Because that's where hopefully you come to new understanding. But we'll be naive to think that it will always come to new understanding or agreement. But that is the reality of life. To pretend that there are no disagreements or to try to prevent those disagreements, I think it's a very sort of childish way of approaching our diversity. So that's one point. But can I ask a question?
Sure. Of me or of everyone,
Oliver,
right?
You said that all your materials are in 3 languages. More than 3. So they're in French, Arabic, or no? What are the languages?
Okay, on languages, it really depends on the type of things we are presenting, but if you look at the 25 masterpieces of the collection, the audio guide for those is in 9 languages. Okay. That's the maximum we can offer, 9 different languages. But for temporary exhibits, if you look at major texts in various spaces, typically it's French and English, and sometimes Spanish if it's Latin America, because it's very widespread in Europe to have people who speak Spanish. But we're able to offer a good variety of linguistic, including non-Western languages.
Okay. And the website is in 3 languages?
Yeah, the website is in 3 languages.
Yeah. And France has how many national languages?
I could come back to that, but it's a long story.
Okay, right. But, okay, so
there is historically one national language, French as we know it today, but French as we know it today is the result of literally bulldozing regional languages in the late 19th century and having school mistresses and school masters go to teach to regions that were very far away from their native region. So there would be no conflict of interest, and they could not be into the same regional linguistic region that they were born in. And so what we see today as French homogeneity, which is a huge asset really in terms of public policy, to maintain unity in diversity is, however, the result of a historically very violent process in the late 19th century.
Thanks for sharing that. Sorry,
Yeah.
so Tan
No,
Hao,
no, my question is
yes.
actually, if we
Yeah.
have 4 national languages, right?
Well, there are 4 official languages.
Four official languages, 1 national language, right? Would it be simpler to declare English as the national language, and then the other 3 languages as the sort of non-official but accepted languages? Because that's the reality out there when you look at what happens on the websites and the materials that we put out by government. And interesting that the comment by Olivia that what you all do for accessibility comes from a sort of a legal framework, right, of the Accessibility Act. And here we have 4 official languages, and the government institutions do not follow the constitutional dictate that we have 4 languages, because most of the material is mainly in English. And I'm glad to say that many of the materials there, but if you look at other museums, right, especially if you want to go to art museum, contemporary art museum, wherever, it's very hard to understand English if it's not your first language or your most familiar language, because the concepts there are very advanced, right? If I'm mainly a Tamil speaker or Malay, and it is an official language, it is my right to have access to that. But we don't see it happening.
So if I can synthesize that, I think you're making the point that cultural institutions and perhaps everyone, well, limiting this discussion to cultural institutions, right, should make a more concerted effort in its public information to create Malay, Chinese, Tamil information, which maybe Kenny can speak to this.
No, my point is not concerted effort, but it should be a requirement.
Wait, and if I could add on that, I think, if I'm not wrong, also with the consideration of who the visitor is. If the exhibition has got more people from a particular group, that the museum has that ability to decide based on the profile of who they think this exhibition is targeted for, then to think about how that public information is communicated. Okay, so that's one question I will ask perhaps Kenny to respond. And maybe just a small broad point that, I mean, English as an official working language, perhaps we take it for granted, and of course there are implications for that official working language, you know, from education to what we do in cultural policy. But I think perhaps it's something we should think about more, But I think many of us take it for granted, the fact that we're having this forum in English, right? And what advantages English gives us. Okay, just my thought. Maybe I ask Kenny to say something,
It is a policy for us to have everything in the museums be in the other, all 4 languages. But also because if I don't have a Tamil translation, I will get complaints. So it's partly it's policy, but also because I have to be concerned for the visitors. And every time we have let's say if it's the exhibition from Myanmar, we work with the community to ensure that there's also, the translation might be tough, but at least there are tours in Burmese.
In Burmese as well, so that's one where you think about the audience and that you need to have Burmese, right?
Yes, so that's quite important. But I have a slightly separate take on the issue of language, which might be a little more pragmatic because of the way, at least at the museum, we tend to interact a lot more with our neighbors, is that it is absolutely critical, actually, to spend more effort on Malay and on our languages because we are in Asia, and we Asia in some ways is our future, whether it's economically or socially or culturally, and whether we like it or not, there will be increasing interactions with our neighbors, and I actually find it increasingly necessary to be able to be comfortable with the various languages. I also say this because, I have the privilege also to be working with some of the regional museums, and we miss out a tremendous amount of research, whether it's academic or curatorial, if we are not able to access those languages. Absolutely. The wonderful work that the museums in China are doing, the wonderful work, for example, that's happening in Southeast Asia, if we are not able to access these languages, we are losing out. We just get one side of the picture. So that's my own take on it.
Thank you for that. I just also quick make point for the work that we do at the Arts Council and the very diligent work that the team tries to build up the Chinese, Malay, and Tamil literary community. So it's not an education policy thing, but trying to understand that we also need to build up the capacity for those literatures. But the challenges we do face, the very practical challenges of trying to find people who have deep language skills and deep interest and the readers to sustain that as well. So yes, those are some of the cultural challenges that I think Singapore needs to face. But I'll put a provocation back to Tan Hao, which is then what can the arts community do as well? You know, what can we all do as a community beyond the cultural institutions to try and bridge that? So, I mean, to some extent, we already have got surtitles, which is great, so that a person who doesn't understand Chinese can watch a Cantonese opera, you know, and it's surtitled in English. But, I mean, it's just an open question, perhaps what more we can do, yeah. If it's all right, I will go to the, can we flash up the pigeonhole? We actually have quite a few questions for Mr. Bosson, actually. You're very popular. I think everybody wants to tap on your wisdom and the practice in K. Branly. The questions, okay, I've been told that I need to press this. Okay, that I need to make it active. So this is a question about underserved communities, and well, it's got the most votes so far, and I think it's an interesting question, a provocative one. Is it offensive, you know, that you target an underserved community in your marketing, you know, suggesting that, you know, you are somehow, you know, not part of the main narrative? Yeah. So that was the question here. And on the related question, there's a question also about how you do your research on visitor profile, but maybe we'll take that first.
Okay, what we call champ social, which is the social field, so to speak, has to do with a set of common characteristics. People with social and/or economic challenges, who are not familiar with museums, who live far from the museum, and/or have limited French language skills. And with those types of parameters, we then organize ourselves so that we get in touch with what we call relays. And relays are the coordinators within each association, not-for-profit, social service, whether government, regional, or local, or city. And we get in contact with those relays, those coordinators, and we offer them to present them with the museum. Last year, we received and trained 380 coordinators in just 1 year. And then they are encouraged to come back with their group. So it's not the museum that gives an injunction for a given audience segment to come to the museum. However, it is the museum that identifies the most efficient relays, offers them the possibility to come to the museum, understand what it is, what they can do with their group, if they wish. As was mentioned earlier today, we have lower rates, lower charges for admission and for activities at the museum, but that's the same for young audiences, for EU students, and for families with many children, so it's not something we reserve for underserved audiences. But again, we work with coordinators, and once they're interested in the museum, they come back with their group.
Okay, so I think it has to be quite thoughtful and deliberate. I think that's one thing that I get. We had a question on visitor profiling as well. If you could take that as well, which is about how the K. Branly does visitor profiling research. And of course, if Kenny has anything to supplement to that, how ACM does that as well.
We have two types of research. One is a research which has gone on for many years. It's called the Permanent Observatory of Audiences, and many major French museums subscribe to our clients, if you want, of that institution. They present a sample of, they present visitors with a series of questions every 3 months by trimester. And they've been doing that for maybe 10, 15 years, and it's the same set of questions. So it gives you the historical depth and the statistical depth and perspective you need on basic questions of what it is they like, what it is they don't like so much, what it is they would like to see improved. And then, on a yearly basis, we collect from all different departments of the museum their wish list for specific analysis and studies, including our own staff, because we have many different specialists in our department. We have an arbitration on what we're going to do for every given year, and it can be how a temporary exhibit is received, or how the audience feels with the offerings in the theater of the museum, whether they feel accessibility has been met during the All Access Week, and we have currently 12 people handing questionnaires all this week to special needs visitors. So we have targeted analysis on top of those historical depth by trimesters.
Kenny, any thoughts to add? Yeah.
I think likewise, we have quite a comprehensive visitor survey that we've been doing for some years to look at various data points, whether it's median age, I mentioned the profile, in terms of income, in terms of gender, in terms of race, of course, but also basic surveys on customer satisfaction, whether the toilets are clean, some of the deeper questions as to what you most remembered at the museum, dwell time, and so on. So there's the sort of museum level survey, but also every single exhibition and program, we have a survey for that as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Because I understand also the underlying implication under the term visitor profiling research. For instance, one thing that we will never do, however, we have a large part of our audience which consists of diasporas from dozens of countries around the world who live in the Paris region. We will never, ever launch into a research over where diasporas from this or that part of the world are concentrated in the Paris region. That goes completely against the grain of what everything France's public policies stand for. On the other hand, we know that those diasporas come willingly and happily to the museum on any given occasion. Case in point, the Madagascar exhibit right now, the first one since 60 years or so. But we certainly don't target them on a research basis.
Yeah, interesting reminder that we all have different operating contexts. I'm going to check in with the crowd to see if anybody has a question or comment, because I think you get the priority. Yes, Kelvin, sorry, yeah. In the middle, yeah. Or you can holler out your question, yeah.
Thank you everyone for sharing. I'm Kelvin from the Urban Redevelopment Authority, dealing with built heritage. But my interest is with, to some extent, intangible cultural heritage that is presented in either through objects, museums, or performances. In a complex multicultural environment where we want to be inclusive, could the panel members share some thoughts about your experience in identifying or training up people who are not just maybe multilingual and interested, but are really able to be that kind of a translator or interpreter of cultures between communities? Because an object, depending on how you write about it from a scholastic sense or from a community sense, can convey so many different meanings. You know, I think, say, the Esplanade has a very good multicultural program for performances throughout the year. The next step, how should we find facilitators to then explain, if you're not from this culture, what does this really, really mean? So you go away with the understanding of not just it being beautiful. So I would love to hear some thoughts from the panel, please.
Oh, sorry, it was a bit echoey. Could you maybe just make, yeah.
Your experience in finding people who can be trained up or have the right attitude to becoming cultural interpreters within the audience.
Yeah, okay, so it's about programming, it's about how you find, about capacity as well, right? Yeah, and how do you find those talents? How do you reach out to diaspora, right?
Maybe I'll start. I mean, I think that speaking from the point of view of a museum of Asian art, first of all, I think I'm privileged because there is a smaller kind of community of individuals in Singapore who are interested in Asian antiquities and Asian heritage. I'm happy that they are at the museum because you do need a certain degree of passion and interest in the subject of Asian history, heritage, art history, and culture. And that is required for you to be able to communicate in the first place the best, what needs to be communicated to various publics. And I believe firmly that even though you could come from different Asian art traditions, as if Indian art or Southeast Asian art or Chinese art, there are certain basic values that all curators in Asian art and all these sort of our educators look out for, and that is we always try to provide to the audiences an information that tells the audience sort of a couple of things, the best thing about that civilization or that piece of that work of art and how that relates to us here in Singapore. That relation to us here is actually very, very important. This relates back, we just launched finished our third floor galleries of what is essentially sacred art, representing the various religions in Asia as well as in Singapore. And in the sort of the planning and the curatorial and the design of those galleries, we're very much conscious that the kinds of messages that we put through have to be universal across these faiths, and that they have to be positive ones. That there is a value, there is a certain constant appreciation for beauty, for goodness, for interactions between communities that we use these objects to try to explain. And in the design and in the sort of presentation of the objects, we treated them with absolute respect, understanding that there needs to be a certain level of divinity that comes through in the design, understanding that the outcome of this is that we need to have various communities of young people in particular coming in and learning about the various faiths that are within their midst. So the curatorial team, I'm very lucky because I have a very cross-cultural curatorial team. I have a curatorial team that is of various faiths, of various ethnicities in Singapore, but also curators who come from abroad. This applies also to my audience team. And I think having that group of a very passionate, somewhat younger, although we display old things, we are actually one of the younger museums in Singapore in terms of the staff. And coming together from their different perspectives, able to find a universality in some way to the messages that we present through the various artifacts and works of art that come from many, many, many different civilizations. I ramble on, but I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Kenny. Anything to add? Anyone else? Okay, we don't have very much time left. I think we have time for one last question, but we're going to make it free for all, whoever wants to grab the mic. Because there actually have been questions directed to all of you, individually, interestingly enough, so that's quite unusual. So whoever wants to answer any of the questions that they see on the screen, please do. We have about another 2 minutes. And for those of you who don't get your questions answered today, please accost our panelists during lunch. Yes. Any takers? Accost nicely, please. They're friends. Yeah.
I might respond to, there's a question for me about this kind of problem of enhancing integration versus segregation in cultural institutions. And I think I'm kind of interested to hear what Olivia was saying about not collecting data on diasporic communities and not kind of in the French context identifying communities and audiences and reporting on them along ethnic or racial lines, because that's something that I think translates very differently to the Singaporean situation and again in the Australian situation. In Australia, it's interesting because there used to be a much more explicit language of multiculturalism in the arts, and that's now become more diffuse. So if we look at the Australia Council's policies, it talks much more generally about diversity, because that's a kind of idea that can be applied to different kinds of diversity. So we can talk about people with disabilities or rural communities. But then what ends up happening is that we sort of lose the ability to talk about cultural difference or, racism, for example, in cultural institutions. So we've kind of adopted I guess, this more integrationist language in the arts and cultural landscape in Australia. And in some ways that's kind of thought of as being progressive because it imagines a much more dynamic and kind of transformative vision of Australian culture, but then loses the ability to talk about inequality and cultural barriers and the ability to report on and be accountable to those kinds of questions of cultural inequality or disadvantage. So, yeah, that's kind of my response to that.
I think we have to end on that thought-provoking note. Okay, one last thing? Yes,
I
please.
saw that Pigeonhole generated quite a large flock of questions. So I'll be happy to answer that individually after the presentation. And earlier this year, I made a presentation on, I remember, family audiences. Obviously, as was mentioned by Professor Fleming, making sure you secure multi-generational interest in a museum is very important, I think. And as Kenny mentioned, I think also that for all the diversity that big museums can offer, it is true that if you make the intellectual effort to identify the key conceptual indicators, that is the common good, beauty, although it's fine if you think that a given piece of art is not beautiful, and openness, without sounding too wishy-washy, you can really make an interesting difference, because otherwise you get into an essentialist discourse where only those who are from a given culture can speak of what is produced by that culture, and where objects can only be presented on their native turf, which ironically could be exactly what very nationalist governments, including in Europe, would be ready to go for. And I don't think that would be an interesting slope to follow.
Thank you.
Since there's one question for me, and I'm dying
to
answer that.
1 minute, 1 minute. Yeah. I'm mindful, we're holding them from lunch.
The person must have looked at my notes, because that's a phrase that I used before, and I was going to use today until I was cut out of time. The answer is this: state-sponsored institutions can deal with the idea of safe spaces for unsafe ideas, museums, theaters, or whatever kind of art spaces, right? By declaring them to be such and protecting them as such safe spaces. And people who try to eat into that space by complaining or I'm offended, whatever, to say, sorry, right? You cannot reduce the space just because you're offended or because you are morally affronted or your grandmother doesn't like it, right? We have declared that it is necessary to have this space for the good of Singapore, for the good of community, for the good of citizenship, right? And you can't encroach on it, so we defend it.
Thank you.
What's happened is that Singapore is the opposite. Whenever somebody tries to encroach it, the state has agreed with these complainants and reduced the space.
Tan Hao, but I think we're going to try and end on an uplifting note and agree that as an aspiration, this is something worth all of us in this room working towards, right? I think we can all agree on that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I agree. I think you all agree with me that it's been a really interesting morning. We've had very diverse views across arts and heritage. And for those of us who are working in or leading cultural institutions or arts agencies, heritage agencies, lots of stuff for us to think about. So please join me to thank our 4 panelists, Kenny Ting, Olivia Basson, Tan Hao, and Dr. Rimi Khan. So with that, I think we can commend ourselves to lunch. Yes.
Thank you very much. And also, of course, a big round of applause for our moderator, Mr. Paul Tan. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you. Can we have a group photograph, please, perhaps? Can we have a group photograph?
Sure.
Please. Perhaps we can just stand around. Thank you very much once again. Well, very interesting panel, very diverse views as well. This is what makes a good panel. So deepest appreciation to our first panel for this conference. Thank you very much. Let's give them a big hand once again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, now before we break for lunch, I just want to inform all of you as well. For panel 3, we do have a need for translation kits because well, we have a speaker who will be speaking in Korean, and there will be a need to translate from Korean to English and English to Korean as well. So once you're done with lunch, I'd like to ask you to please kindly pick up your translation kits at the registration table where you registered this morning. All right, but lunch, otherwise, same place on your left-hand side. You can pick up the translation kit on your right-hand side. Please be back here. We will begin once again at 2 p.m. All right, the time now is about 12:35. We'll see you at 2 p.m. Thank you very much, and see you after lunch.